Hello friends, welcome to Universe of Naruto X. If you love Naruto what if stories and anime explanations, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin today's story. Nar sighed to himself tiredly as he ran a wet rag across the top of the elongated desk table. It was nearly 4:30 in the afternoon, and he had yet to leave the academy for the day. The reasoning for his inability to leave the educational institution was, as it always was, disruptive behavior with a touch of vandalism thrown in. Towards the end of the day, the blonde had illustrated multiple profanities on the chalkboard on which Iruka was writing during a class intermission. The gag had garnered a few laughs from his classmates, but Iruka had been less than amused. Punishments were far from foreign to the young ninja to be, almost by his own design given his behavior, but they never grew any less tedious. This occasion in particular was dull as could be, with Naro having been ordered to clean the desks, chalkboard, and floors of the main classroom. He had been working at a respectable rate for nearly an hour, and he still had much to do. Based upon crude mental mathematics, it would be another 90 minutes until Naruto's obligations would be completely finished. An irritated grumble escaped from the blonde. "I didn't even write that much," he muttered dejectedly while he rued the cleaning rag for further use. Finding that insanity was the most likely outcome should he simply clean without distraction, mental or physical, Nar allowed his mind to wander. From the moment he had awoken that morning to his present situation, the blonde reviewed his day. He took apart certain subjects meticulously and simply ignored others. After several runs through his recent memories, one event continually nagged at his conscience. Finally conceding, Nar allowed himself to delve into the specific aspect of that day that he had intentionally omitted from his mental review. While the cleaning had been his first officially assigned disciplining of the day, it was in reality the second in general. During the same hour in which he had vandalized the chalkboard, Iruka had instructed the class to complete what was intended to be a bond-building exercise. Each student was asked to write down who they would desire to spend their final day on Earth with given a choice. The point of the activity was clear. It was meant to encourage openness and honesty. For most of the class, the goal was achieved. For Nar, it did nothing but force him to confront the bleak state of his social standing within the cold society in which he lived. He had left his slip blank. After a few moments of consideration, his initial instinct had been to pencil in the name of Sakura Haruno, a girl whom he had taken an interest in, but soon found that the most likely outcome of spending his final hours with her would be repeated complaints and ridicule on her end. The choices of each student had been left anonymous, save for those who had felt the needless desire to announce their chosen person aloud. The vast majority of the female population had likely chosen Sasaki Uchiha to be their companion. In fact, it would have been far from surprising if all of them had. At that thought, Nurid chuckled to himself. All he'd do is glance at you every once in a while and sulk. You wouldn't get your happy ending, he thought to himself humorously. Seconds later, he reached the end of the penultimate elongated desk from the top of the room. He then made his way up another step to begin cleaning the last row. As he glanced down the tabletop, he spotted a pile of supplies at the end of the desk. The pile consisted of a notebook, a few pencils, and a folder. Most of it was light purple in color. Deciding to give in to his curiosity, Naruto set his rag down and shook out his hands. He then made his way over to the pile and studied it carefully, attempting to decipher the identity of the owner with only the information available. After a brief consideration, Naruto pinned down the most probable candidate. Ha didn't really think of her as the forgetful type. But what do I know? He mused as the image of Hinata Hyuga. An odd quiet girl flashed through his mind. Always seating herself in the leftmost upper corner of the room. The prestigiously surnamed girl rarely spoke unless directly prompted and had a variety of strange habits. She tended to fidget with her hands quite often and routinely bit her lower lip for seemingly no reason at all, though she tended to be staring at the floor near Naruto while doing the latter. Nar knew little about her beyond the habits he had noticed passively other than her seeming love for the color of purple. As he looked over the collection of educational objects, he came upon something interesting. Sticking out of the side of her notebook was the very same slip of paper that had been distributed to the class to write down their choices. While the majority of the students had turned in their slips, two people had not opted to give their paper to Ruka. One of them was Nar, who had figured that turning in a blank slip could have been viewed as an act of defiance. The second had been a total mystery. That's kind of weird. I've got my reasons, but her. I figured it was Sasuke. Naruto thought skeptically. The slip was facing downwards, making the name that was likely written on the other side, invisible positionally. The blonde stared at the half-visible slip for nearly a minute before reaching forward. I probably shouldn't, but what's the harm in seeing Sasake's name on some paper? He joked to himself as he reached forward. He then pulled the slip free from between the pages of the notebook and flipped it over. Much to his great shock, Sasake's name was not written. Instead, Naruto's own name was painstakingly written in expectedly flawless handwriting. The blonde did a double take at the sight, completely dumbfounded by the revelation. But why? He muttered in confusion as he tucked the slip back into the notebook. That very question circulated through his mind like a storm as he slowly returned to his cleaning duties. From that question was born another of similar nature, but much more specific. Why didn't she turn it in? Those were anonymous to everybody but Iruka-sensei. He wondered pensively. A variety of possible answers crossed his mind, many of which were self-deprecating and depressing. As he slipped into a state of unsettled confusion, the door to the classroom slowly opened with a creaking sound. The noise snapped Naruto out of his trance and drew his gaze to the front of the room. Who he saw caused his stomach to drop. Forgive my intrusion. I forgot my things earlier today. Hinata, who had just entered the room, stuttered awkwardly. Nar followed her with his eyes as she carefully made her way up the steps towards her seat. When she reached her things, she deliberately examined her notebook, breathing an audible sigh of relief at the revelation that the slip of paper had not been moved to her knowledge. The reaction drew a raised eyebrow from Nar. So, she didn't want me to see it, he observed as Hinata gathered her supplies into her arms. Once all of her possessions had been accounted for, the Haga girl pushed her chair back in and straightened her posture. After a moment, she turned her head to glance at Nar. This brought the pair to eye contact. For reasons unbeknownst to the blonde, Hinata reined instantly. There's something you need. And Naruto-kun? She asked a tad shakily. The blonde remained silent for a moment, completely unprepared for conversation. After scrambling for an answer, he responded, "What did you think of that weird last day thing we did today?" He asked quickly. The question appeared to be the exact wrong one. As Hinata shifted uncomfortably at the words, "Well, I thought that it was a good way to lighten the mood after a hard day," she replied, her face still a deep red color. Nar nodded and absently scrubbed away at a spot of dirt on the desk. "Yeah, I guess it was supposed to be anonymous, but people started blurting things out pretty quick," he said. Hinata studied him as he cleaned and furrowed her eyebrows. Why are you here so late cleaning?" She asked when her fellow classmate didn't immediately respond. She tacked on a panicked follow-up. "If you don't mind me asking of course," she added quickly. Nar shrugged and sighed heavily as he prepared to begin cleaning the floors. Iruka-sensei's orders. It's my punishment for that stuff I wrote on the board earlier. He explained at the memory. Hinata frowned. All of this for that. How harsh. She said sympathetically. Nar shook his head and reached for the cleaning rag which he had left on the desk above him. Not really. I decided to try to be funny. And I'm paying for it. Oh well, not like I'm going to stop, he said with a slight grin. Hinata suppressed a giggle at his still extant enthusiasm. It was funny to me at least, she said quietly. Despite her hushed tone, Naruto heard her and glanced up. Thanks, you and a few other people, he said gratefully. Both children then lapsed into silence. After a few minutes, Hinata looked to the clock and sighed internally. I must be going. Thank you for the conversation, she said with a bow before turning her back and heading for the door. As she walked away, an idea popped into Naruto's head. He then stood up and looked to the door, which Hinata was halfway through. Hey, wait, he called out. The Hyuga girl tensed and let out an odd squeaking sound, but did as she was told and glanced over her shoulder. Yes, Naruto-kun, she asked nervously. Nar sat down atop one of the lean desks and gathered himself a bit. Who did you write down on your slip? He asked, curious to see if she would openly admit her unusual choice. Hinata averted her eyes and took another step out of the classroom in response. Oh, just nobody of note, she stammered quickly before disappearing into the hallway. Nar gazed at the empty doorway for several moments before shrugging and returning to his painstaking cleaning. Nobody of note, huh? Yeah, maybe that's me, he thought to himself a tad dejectedly. He then glanced back at her desk once again. She still forgot her pencils. Hinata tore through the halls of the Hauga state at a blistering pace, her face still burning red. After haphazardly turning several corners and weaving around a few different family members, the girl reached her bedroom. She quickly opened the door and stepped inside, practically slamming it shut upon entry. She then sat down and leaned her back against the hardwood, taking several deep breaths to calm herself down. Once she was sufficiently composed, the Hyuga girl set her things down to her left. That was stressful, she thought to herself as the contents of her brief encounter with Naruto Uzumaki came flooding through her frazzled mind. Her exit from the final stage of their conversation had been unceremonious, and she knew it. I was doing so well, she whispered to herself as she lamented the panic attack she had experienced as she was exiting the classroom. Despite the negative nature of the conclusion, from her perspective, at least there was much that brought her relief as well. He asked me who I wrote down, which means he didn't check my slip. I'd have passed out if he had, she thought a bit more calmly. Another consideration then occurred to her. Why did he want to know in the first place, though? That was the first time I've spoken to him at length at all, she pondered. She then entertained herself with wishful thinking for several moments before returning herself to reality. I wonder who he wrote down. Sakura-asan would be my first guess. Yes, that's probably it, she thought to herself. The notion saddened her greatly for both selfish and selfless reasons. On the selfish side, it made the timid girl greatly jealous. But on the less self-centered end, the routine verbal abuse Sakura dealt to Naruto was something Hinata found increasingly difficult to watch. He deserves better than to be ridiculed in his final hours. So much better, she thought firmly. Despite her assuredness at that fact, she found herself at a loss for what she herself would do given his company at such a time. Though, I suppose my stuttering and blushing wouldn't be much of an improvement. Maybe I'd be bolder given the knowledge that it was my final chance, she admitted mentally. Hinata then stood up and walked to her bed, flopping down onto it once she reached it. How open would you be? Would that oh so enthusiastic mask of yours remain at the end of your rope? She wondered aloud in reference to her most favored classmate. It hadn't taken the heiress long to decipher the falsehood that was Naruto Uzumaki's trademark grin after she had begun to watch him regularly. It was the times at which it most commonly appeared that had given it all away. Anytime he was under siege emotionally, the grin appeared. As with moments of stress and uncertainty, never was that smile visible when he was or thought he was alone. Such moments were rare to see, but Hinata had seen more than a sufficient amount to recognize the pattern. In spite of the outwardly depressing nature of the blonde's emotions during these occurrences, they almost always came coupled with a tangible stubbornness to continue that often manifested itself in the form of intense physical conditioning. Nar received little to no reverence from his classmates. But the one thing he was respected for was his cardiovascular endurance, the source of which was unknown to all but Hinata. How funny. At your lowest points is where I find you most beautifully admirable. Never change, Naroke_, she thought to herself. She then rolled onto her side and pulled something out of her jacket pocket. If only you could calm down for picture day. Oh well, I'll take what I can get, she thought to herself humorously as she gazed at a roll call photo of Nar she had stolen. The picture featured a very energized Nar making a mocking face at the photographer who had evidently given up on the prospect of taking a proper picture. The heiress then tucked it back into her pocket and returned her gaze to the ceiling. I have some ground to stand on with you conversationally now, so perhaps I could try to engage with you a bit. Narokan, she thought. The very thought brought heat to her cheeks. Hinata groaned and covered her face with her hands. I'm hopeless, she muttered aloud. A sigh then escaped her lips as her eyelids grew heavy. It was now 6 o'clock and dinner was scheduled for 7. Sleep had to be staved off for another hour. Once that fact had been recalled, Hinata swung her legs over the side of her bed and stood up. I may as well walk to keep myself conscious. Hinata sighed dejectedly as she seated herself at one of the academy's picnic tables. It was the scheduled lunch period for the students of the educational facility, and the weather was pleasant. As such, they had been granted the privilege of eating their meals outside for the first time in several months. Such days were fairly common 9 months out of the year, but winter months tended to be harsh. Despite the somewhat special occasion, Hinata still found herself disappointed by the day as it stood. The previous night, the young heiress had sworn up and down that she would take steps to initiate conversation with Nar, and she had failed to do so beyond a feeble attempt at a greeting that morning. I know what I want to say and even a bit of what I'd use for topics, but I just can't speak properly, she thought to herself dejectedly. The girl's stutter was a consistent speech impediment, but it was only a legitimate issue when face to face with the subject of her admiration. Usually, she could speak relatively clearly with only a few breaks in her sentences. With Naruto, however, she often struggled to even form words to begin speaking at all. And when she could bring herself to speak, she regularly spoke in a tone akin to a whisper. The previous day had been the closest thing to stability she had managed to achieve in his presence, but she had still fallen to pieces at the very end. Maybe I could ask another classmate to take his seat before he arrives next hour. Then I could offer him the empty seat next to mine, she pondered. After a moment's consideration, she shook her head and rested her chin on her hands. That would be selfish, though. I shouldn't be so devious, she scolded herself. The Hyuga girl then opened her lunch pail and extracted a trio of rice balls, setting them on a napkin in front of her to begin her meal. Before she could even take hold of one of the morsels of food, the sound of approaching footsteps caught her attention and drew her gaze upwards from the table. Seemingly in scorn of her stress at the idea of encountering Nar alone once again, the blonde stood in front of her chosen table. Sorry for barging in, but you forgot these yesterday, Naruto said, scratching the back of his head as he laid 3 pencils down on the table in front of her. Hinata simply stared at her lost supplies for a moment, earning an odd look from her classmate. You all right? He asked skeptically. His words snapped the AYS out of her shock-induced stupor instantly. She quickly nodded her head and took the pencils one by one. She placed them on top of her notebook that sat to her left. Why, yes, forgive my rudeness. I was spacing out, she said apologetically. Nurad stifled a laugh at her comical levels of discomfort and gave her an all too familiar grin. No, you're all good. No need to apologize, he assured her jovially. Hinata did her best to gather herself as subtly as possible. Thank you, IG guess. I appreciate why you returning my things, she said with a seated bow. To her surprise, Naruto laughed aloud at the gesture. She gave him a look of embarrassed confusion, which prompted the outcast boy to calm himself to speak. Man, you're real formal. Loosen up a little, he said humorously. Hinata leaned and lowered her eyes to the table. Oh, I am sorry. I'll work on it, she said quietly. It took her only a moment to realize what she had done. She immediately sighed and hid her face with her hands to conceal her burning cheeks. I apologized again, didn't I? She asked in a muttering tone. Naruto nodded and scratched the back of his head. That's a habit for you, isn't it? He inquired in response. Hinata removed her hands from her face and looked at him again. Just a little, she said, clamping her mouth shut afterwards to prevent another awful stutter. She then took a bite from her rice ball and chewed it slowly to calm herself. Unfortunately, the action sent the incorrect message to Nar, who took a step back and turned around. Well, I'll leave you to eat. See you around, Hinata, he said with a backwards wave. Hinata's stomach dropped and her eyes widened. She then surprised them both. No, wait, she called out to him, her timidity and stutter momentarily vanishing. The blonde stopped in his tracks and glanced back at her over his shoulder. Need something? He asked. The young heiress forced herself to remain straight in posture as she gathered her words. IW was just wondering if UW wanted to sit with me. You don't if you don't want to, she replied, tapping her index fingers together nervously. Nar turned around fully and shrugged his shoulders. Sure, if you want me to, he said, much to Hinata's delight. He then sat down across from her at the picnic table and rested his elbows atop the platform. Thank you, Naruto-kun. I don't get much C company, she said gratefully. Nar chuckled a bit and drummed his fingers on the table. Yeah, neither do I. Lunch is usually pretty quiet for me, he replied. Hinata smiled and took another small bite of her rice. Well, I don't really see why that should be the case. You're perfectly pleasant, she said kindly. Nar gave her a look resembling one of skepticism. Sorry if this comes off as rude, but how would you know? We haven't really talked much, he asked, not having expected to be put on the spot. Hinata fumbled for a feasible response that didn't involve revealing her habit of watching him. I just haven't seen anything that suggests otherwise. Why you've been nice to me? She stammered, tripping over her words several times. Nar remained silent, seemingly deciding whether or not he found the explanation to be sufficient to quell his curiosity. After a painstaking minute and a half, he nodded and rested his face in one of his hands. Yeah, all right. You've been pretty nice, too, so thanks for that, he said. Hinata released the breath she had been unconsciously holding and relaxed considerably. She then finished the last of her first rice ball. Her following action to take hold of her second caught Naruto's attention, who for the first time noticed the actual identity of the food she was eating. Rice balls. That's kind of fancy. Where do you buy them? He asked. The heiress wiped a few stray grains of rice from her lips and shook her head. Actually I made them. My lunches are as self-prepared, she corrected quietly. The blonde mouthed the word. Wow. And studied the remaining rice ball. That's well made. You've got to be a decent cook, he said, clearly impressed by the information being presented to him by his lunchmate. Hinata began tapping her index fingers together again, which went unnoticed by Nar. I just have lots of practice. I've been making this kind of thing for years, she said in an attempt to downplay her culinary skill. Naruto shrugged again and scratched the side of his face. Maybe, but that's still impressive as hell, he praised, causing Hinata to lean further. She quickly searched for a smooth way to change the topic as her composure was unlikely to hold on the current track. What she hit upon, however, was more concerning than she had hoped to find. Where is why your lunch Naruto? She asked curiously. Naruto's posture and demeanor instantly changed. His comfort gave way to obvious discomfort and his positive expression fell a tad. None of the changes were extreme, but they were noticeable. I already ate. I finish up pretty quick most of the time, he responded robotically. Hinata furrowed her eyebrows in concern and studied him. It was an obvious lie and a poor one at that. Beyond the blatantly stilted nature of his tone when responding, he was still eyeing the rice, likely subconsciously. I doubt that. You still appear quite hungry to me, Hinata challenged, her stutter gone entirely. Nar did an almost imperceptible double take before sighing. Yeah, fine. I didn't bring any, he admitted quietly. There was then a silence as both searched for the next path to take conversationally. It was Hinata who found it first. She held out her final rice ball to him across the table. Take it, you need to eat, she urged him, her sudden surge of firmness continuing on. The blonde stared at her outstretched hand blankly for a few seconds before reaching out and gingerly taking it from her. Thanks, Hinata, he muttered, taking a bite of the rice as he spoke. After a few moments of chewing, Naruto rapidly consumed the rest of the rice. Once he was finished, he looked back to Hinata, who was looking tense. Damn, that's really good, he said with a thumbs up. Whatever mystical confidence Hinata had conjured to offer him a portion of her food instantly gave way to shyness. I'm glad you liked it, Naruto. I wish I had more to give you, but I don't, she said, her tone growing glum by the end. The blonde shook his head. No, don't waste your energy on that. I'm fine with just one. Really, thank you, he said sincerely. The ice made a mental note to make 5 instead of 3 the following morning, but feigned agreement. Okay. Just feel free to ask if you ever forget your food, she said. Before Naruto could respond, a bell sounded off to signify the end of the lunch period. The noise prompted the outcast boy to stand to his feet and stretch. Thanks for sharing with me. I appreciate it, Hinata. I'll see you around, he said as he prepared to leave. For the second time that hour, the Aries stepped outside of her own boundaries. And Naruto-kun, she called meekly. Her classmate turned to face her and motioned for her to continue. Yeah, he asked skeptically. Hinata gestured to the table they had eaten at and then clasped her hands together down in front of her waist to hide the slight tremor in them. See, could we do this again? Eating together. I am mean, she requested. Naruto cracked a smile and nodded before turning to make his way into the academy building. Fine with me, he said before jogging off. Hinata watched him leave for several moments before allowing the heat in her face to take full effect. She then stood up and followed after him to return to the main building. Hai studied his daughter carefully as she entered through the gates of the Hyuga estate property. For the second consecutive day that week, her demeanor was deviant from her usual meek sulk. The previous day, she had looked several steps beyond stressed and had openly sprinted to her personal quarters before shutting herself in until dinner. Now, she was quite the opposite. She wore a look of contentment rather than one of terror or depressive glumness. She looked quite pleased with herself, if anything. Quite a shift. How interesting. The clan head glanced to his left to face the voice where Neji now stood with the tea he had requested several minutes beforehand. After accepting the near-boiling liquid and setting it aside to cool for the time being, Hiyashi nodded in agreement. Interesting indeed, certainly not unwelcome, but quite curious in its extremity, he replied as Hinata disappeared into the doorway of the main house. Once she was entirely out of earshot, Hiyashi looked back to Neji, who had sat down to his right in a nearby chair. Have you any idea as to the cause? He asked. The younger of the two Hyuga shrugged his shoulders and leaned back in his chair. Nothing especially specific. No, perhaps she scored excellently on a test of some kind, he suggested. Hai shook his head and stroked his chin thoughtfully. No, I doubt that's the cause. Her marks are quite consistently sublime. The academy occasionally hosts in-class competitions, so there's a chance she placed well in one of them, he said, seeming to think aloud. Nate chuckled and kicked off one of his sandals. That still wouldn't explain her mood yesterday. Hinata-sama has never been an extrovert, but that was unusual even by her standards. She had the eyes of a hunted deer, he said with a touch of humor in his voice. Hai sighed. True, which is what makes this all so puzzling. Maybe concerning myself with it is a poor choice. Sitting and watching may be my best choice, he pondered. Nei gave him an odd look. With all due respect, Hai Ashi-sama. Letting things play out on their own has never been a strength of yours, he pointed out. The clan head nodded in agreement. Especially in regards to my children. I tend to overreact a bit moment to moment. The last time something like this happened. It turned out that Hanab was simply caring for a stray kitten, he said, searching for lessons to be learned from the previous experience. And now that cat is terrified of me, he muttered under his breath. Neji stifled a laugh and stood to his feet in order to return to his duties. In all fairness, most infantile animals are afraid of you on some level, he said. Then he put his stray sandal back on his foot and went on his way. Once he was gone, Hiyashi reached for his tea and sipped it for a few moments. The temperature was nearly perfect now. It's probably nothing at all. All the same, I find this all to be quite interesting. Let's see how long this change lasts, he thought to himself. A raindrop then struck his forehead. Breathing another sigh, Hiyashi stood to his feet and quickly made his way back into the main house. Ever-changing weather, how fitting. Rare was the day that Naruto Uzumaki was legitimately exhausted by the time 9 o'clock rolled around. Most of the time, it wouldn't be until nearly 1 in the morning that Naruto would be sufficiently tired enough to fall asleep easily. Fortunately or unfortunately, one of those uncommon occasions had arrived for the blonde. Reasons for his lack of energy were numerous, both in the physical and mental realms. Physically speaking, he had worked himself into the ground after his instruction at the academy had concluded. 4 miles of running, over an hour of short drilling, and 75 push-ups had left his body ragged. On the more psychological level, he had been wrestling with several unanswered questions for the majority of his day past lunch. The first that had been circling his subconscious was not new, as it was the very same that he had been struggling with from the moment that he had discovered his name on Hinata's slip of paper. The simple question of why troubled him greatly, and the answer had become no less clear. The other unknowns bothering him were far more recently formed. They were questions of when, and another case of why. Nar, who was situated on the edge of his bed, pondered these 3 questions repeatedly, approaching each from different angles. Frustratingly, his lack of information prevented him from advancing his analysis any further than it had already gone. Sighing heavily, Nar took one final crack at the most recent of these questions. Since when have you been so friendly, Hinata? How long have you been willing to actually be nice to me? He wondered to himself. It was easily the most pressing of his concerns regarding the shy girl he had eaten with earlier that day, as it was the most perplexing in nature. First, she asks me to stay and eat with her. Then she gives me food. Then she says she wants to eat with me more often. If she's always felt that open to it, why hasn't she offered before? I'd have been open to the company, he thought to himself, shaking his head to clear his mind. The blonde laid back flat on the bed. I guess complaining about it is stupid. At least she's willing now. Not like I have many options for friends, he conceded. Deciding to take his thoughts in a more positive direction to avoid poor sleep. Nar moved to another perspective. You'd think somebody with her last name would be a real drag to be around, but she's actually pretty nice. Really weird, but definitely nice. Wonder why she's always red-faced. Though, he mused to himself. The memory of the food she had given him then returned to the forefront of his mind. I don't even like rice, but that was really good. It actually had some flavor to it. Maybe I should forget my lunch more often, he joked. Another aspect of their interaction soon came into the spotlight of his focus. Why does she always call me Naruto-kun? Isn't that kind of thing supposed to be for people you're close with? I don't hate it, honestly, but it's still weird, he pondered. For the next few minutes, he reviewed his day as a whole down to fairly minute details. Eventually, his eyelids began to grow heavy. Feeling the need to sleep, Nar crawled underneath the thin covers of his bed and closed his eyes. He was asleep within 60 seconds of laying his head down. Hinata straightened herself and took a deep breath as she reached forward to knock for the 5th time in 3 minutes. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, only an hour after the students of the academy had been released to go about their unbound lives. The day had been relatively uneventful, save for the numerous points at which Hinata's internal body temperature had reached record levels during lunch period with a certain individual. Hinata's comfort in conversation with Naruto had increased slightly during their second meal together, but she still often found herself struggling to articulate herself properly. Luckily for her, Naruto seemed to find her awkwardness endearing. He regularly laughed jovially in response to her stutters and had even encouraged her at points to continue speaking despite her struggles. After lunch had concluded, the final 2 classes of the day had occurred. The first of these was a historical course on the past happenings of the world around them. From politics to combative records, it was exceptionally dull. Even the AYS, who was generally quite interested in history, found herself struggling to stay conscious throughout the class many days. As per usual, she had spent the majority of the 90 minutes the class occupied gazing at the back of Naruto's head longingly. The final instruction period of the day was a bit more interesting, with that being a mathematical class regarding projectiles. She had still picked her spots to admire Naruto at points, but kept her focus sharp for most of the class. Once both of the concluding classes had ended, the building emptied out quickly in the way it always did. Hinata herself tended to remain for a few moments after the fact to take a short inventory of what needed to be done for the following day. This process usually took anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the magnitude of the assignments being forced upon the student body. The thing that had led her to the door she now stood before was the fact that she had noticed Naruto's things lying on his desk after his departure. He, like she had 2 days previously, had forgotten his supplies. Taking it upon herself to return them to their owner, Hinata had taken Naruto's supplies with her when she exited the building. The heiress had opted to stop back at her home to deposit her own things to lighten her carrying load, and justifiably so. The combined weight of their supplies approached 20 pounds, and the walk between their homes, combined with the distance from the academy to the Hyuga estate, was nearly 3 miles in total. Once she had reached her home, one thing led to another, and Hinata had wound up taking nearly 45 minutes to make herself more presentable for the admittedly minor occasion. In the end, however, her timidity had limited her to only putting on a pair of earrings and scurrying out of the estate with Naruto's things. She now stood before his apartment's door and had been for roughly 10 minutes. Self-talk had done little to raise her confidence to the level required to knock on the door. Over and over, she had reached out. But time and time again, she had faltered. It isn't that difficult. Just reach out, knock 3 times, and wait, she told herself for the 100th time. Finally, after much struggle, the Hyuga girl rapped her knuckles on the wooden door 3 times in quick succession. For a few tense moments, no answer came. Just as Hinata had begun to relax with guilty relief that she would no longer be forced to potentially embarrass herself, the door creaked open. On the other side of the door frame was Nar, who looked a bit groggy. Hinata, what are you doing here? He asked through a yawn. His question snapped Hinata out of a trance induced by Naruto's disheveled appearance, causing her to flinch and back up a step. I think you forgot why your things in Naruto, she said, offering his things to him with a polite bow. The blonde seemed to awaken a tad at the sight of his belongings. Oh yeah, I think I did, he said as he slowly took them from the shy girl before him. Once he had set his supplies off to the side just inside his apartment, he frowned and studied Hinata carefully. How do you find out my address? I don't remember telling you what it was, he asked curiously. Hinata led her eyes away from the floor into her classmates' faces. I asked the R receptionist in the L lobby. I'd seen you enter this B building in P passing before S. So I assumed Ul lived here, she explained as calmly as she could, seemingly accepting the information. Nar nodded. All right, that makes sense. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it, he said gratefully. The heiress smiled and shook her head. And no need to thank me. Why you did the same for me only 2 days ago. Were ye even now? She said. The blonde raised an eyebrow and cracked a grin. I owed you before, huh? Guess I should keep that in mind next time you do something for me. Can't imagine what you do to me if I didn't return the favor. He replied jokingly. Hinata immediately turned red and tensed. And no that's not how I meant it. IW was. She began, her voice clearly panicked. Before she could finish her feeble sentence, she was cut off by Naruto's humorous laughter. After taking a moment to gather himself, the blonde put a hand on her shoulder. You're all good. I'm just messing with you. Like I said before, try to loosen up a little. Have some fun, Yano, he said. Hinata felt herself go numb at the sudden physical contact, but through a Herculean effort managed to remain conscious. Oh, I suppose I must look quite foolish right now. Huh? She asked, a small smile on her face. Nar removed his hand from her shoulder, much to her disappointment, and shrugged. No, not really. You just took me wrong, which is fine either way. Thanks for bringing my stuff. I'd have totally forgotten till tomorrow if you hadn't, he said while scratching the back of his head. Hinata nodded. It was the least I could do. Why you don't have to thank me? She said kindly. A personal dream of the young Hyuga was then unwittingly fulfilled by Nar. Wanna to come inside? I've got nothing to do so I wouldn't mind some company. He offered, then oddly he continued on. Not that you have to. If you have better things to do that's fine too, he said quickly. Hinata, who had been questioning her hearing a moment before, immediately nodded her head. Yes, of course. IW would like that be very much. Actually, she said. Her common habit of poking her indexes together resurfacing in obvious fashion. The response seemed to surprise her classmate, but nonetheless, he stepped aside to clear a path into his dwelling. It isn't much in here, and I really haven't cleaned up, but it's where I live, he said with a chuckle as Hinata slowly made her way into the apartment she had never dared to imagine she would ever have a chance to enter. Once inside, she took a moment to assess the living space. It was simple, but fairly practical given its owner, a small kitchen, an even smaller living room, and a short hallway that likely led to the bathroom and bedroom. As you said it and needs a little bit of clean up but it's quite a nice I think Hinata said. Naruto then directed her to the dining room where a table and 2 chairs were positioned. Once they were seated the blonde Winston gave her a guilty look. I don't really have enough food for 2 people right now. So if you get hungry I can't really help you. He said awkwardly. His words instantly drew a look of puzzlement from Hinata. What do you mean? I'm not hungry, so you won't have to worry. But how is it that you're so low on food? She asked, her stutter once again absent in a moment of genuine concern. Nar stared down at the table. I can't afford that much, he said quietly. The AY's confusion only grew in the wake of his response, and her questions increased in number. Is your family's income really that poor? She asked, trying as best she could to broach the topic gently. Nar then looked back up at her, his expression having shifted to one of resignation. You haven't figured it out yet, have you? Thing is, I don't have a family or an income. I'm kind of on my own, he said in a painfully matter-of-fact tone. Hinata's eyes widened as several pieces fell into place. So that's why he's always conditioning himself alone. It also explains the lack of variety in his outfits, she thought to herself. She then returned her attention to the boy across the table, who was looking quite self-conscious. I had no idea. Forgive my ignorance, she said gently. Nar sighed and shook his head tiredly. He then removed his orange jacket and tossed it over towards the doorway, revealing a black t-shirt underneath. No, you're fine. I don't talk about it much, so you had no way to know, he assured her. A depressive silence then took hold of the small apartment for a minute or two. Eventually, Nar spoke. Sometimes you quit stuttering. It happens out of nowhere. Why is that? He asked curiously, not having noticed the disappearance of her speech impediment. Hinata's shyness returned with a fury. I never noticed. How strange, she said at the sound of her own voice and the stutter that came with it. The heiress groaned and hid her face in her hands. Nar smiled at her endearing struggle and allowed himself to relax a bit. Head up, Hinata. We've both got our struggles. I'm poor and you stutter a lot. Big deal, he said in an attempt to cheer her up. Hinata, who was now openly laying her head atop her arms on the table, peeked up at him. Being poor is definitely a big deal. And Naruto if you see can't eat, you see can't stay healthy. I hate the sound of that, she said. Nar maintained eye contact and studied her. What's my health mean to you? I'm just your classmate, Hinata. It shouldn't matter so much to you, he said. The heiress stood up from her chair suddenly. And why shouldn't it? You're just as valuable as anybody else. You're a human being and you deserve to be cared for like one. Have some self-worth, Naruto. Please, she said, her tone making it perfectly clear that there was no argument to be had. Nar stared at her wide-eyed for several moments before responding. I think your stutter goes away when you're angry, he said somewhat fearfully. The Hyuga girl shook her head and sat back down. Were you even listening to me? She asked in a lighter tone. The blonde pursed his lips and nodded before sighing heavily. Yeah, I heard you. I'm not used to hearing that kind of thing, you know. Uruka-sensei has been nice and all that, but even he has his limits. Thank you, Hinata. Really? He said quietly. Hinata gazed at him softly and bit her lower lip. Why? Why has nobody told you that you matter? That's so cruel, she asked britly. Nar gave a hollow laugh and shifted in his seat. I wish I knew. Might not help anything, but at least I'd have some peace of mind or whatever it's called, he replied numbly. The ice took a deep breath to calm herself. Please know that you are worth something. You have value. You have good qualities. Qualities that I personally liked quite a lot, she said. Her timidity preventing her from fully staving off her stutter until the end. Her final comment, unlike her previous bold encouragements, drew a smile out of Nar. Thank you, Hinata. I'll try to remember all of that, he replied. Hinata returned the smile and inwardly sighed out of relief. A quick glance at the clock hanging on the wall then revealed that the girl's curfew was fast approaching. Hinata's face fell visibly as she stood up out of her chair again. She then bowed to her host and classmate. Thank you for having me, Naruto. It wasn't the most pleasant conversation. But I'm glad to have learned a bit about Wu, she said sincerely before turning around and heading for the door. Just before she could turn the handle, Naruto spoke up. I don't know you super well, but I like a lot of stuff about you too, Hinata. You're really cool, he said with a thumbs up and a grin. Hinata kept her back turned to him to conceal her burning cheeks. I'm glad you think so. I hope I can live up to that opinion, she said before opening the door and disappearing into the hallway and shutting the apartment behind her. As her footsteps grew quieter, Naruto smiled and let out a sigh. Weird girl, but man, you won't find a nicer one, he said to no one in particular. The blonde then retrieved his tossed jacket and hung it up as neatly as he could. Then a thought crossed his mind. Isn't there usually an open seat near her? Hinata pulled the hood of her jacket off as she entered the front door of the main Hyuga building. She had made it within seconds of her curfew's expiration. Too close for comfort was something of an understatement. It was now 6:30, which meant that dinner would be served in less than an hour. There was much to be done in a fairly short span of time. Before she could even take a step towards her room's hall, the sound of a clearing throat caught her attention. Snapping to attention and whirling around in an instant, Hinata bowed to her father, who had been silently waiting in a room to the side of the entryway. In the nick of time, at ease, he said calmly. Hinata released the breath she had been holding and relaxed considerably. I didn't mean to cut it so close. Father, something came up, she said a tad too vaguely. Hai raised an eyebrow and motioned for his daughter to join him in the side room. Hinata quickly followed the silent order and sat down across from him in the dimly lit room. Once she was situated, the clan head spoke once again. Explain what kept you. Be honest with me. I'm in a pleasant mood. He urged her, knowing full well that lying was both foolish and a waste of time. Hinata took a deep breath to begin her explanation. My classmate forgot his tea things at the academy. Son decided to help him by returning them to his residence, she explained. Her father nodded and thought for a moment. A valid cause, but a simple delivery wouldn't take you so long. I'm assuming the two of you spent a stretch of time conversing. Correct? He asked. The heiress nodded in response. Hai then posed the question she had been dreading. Which classmate of yours was it? To my knowledge, you interact very little with your peers, he inquired. Hinata shifted uncomfortably and fidgeted. She said, completely unsure of how to approach the revelation of Naruto's identity to a person who was more likely than most to find him appalling. When her thinking process stretched on for too long, Hiyashi cleared his throat once again. Out with it, Hinata. I'm sure this person's name isn't unpronounceable, he said a bit more sternly. The younger of the two Hyuga then swallowed and looked to the floor. Naro Uzuaki, she said as quietly as she could. The following pause was nearly unbearable for the poor girl, who had braced herself for the words of her father's disapproval well ahead of time. Well, that's certainly a surprise. Not the fact that he forgot his items. That much sounds standard, but that you actually spent time engaging him in conversation. When did you grow so social, my daughter? Hayashi asked much to her shock and relief. He invited me into his home to converse and I felt I had the time to spare so I obliged. Is that a problem? She asked, deciding to test her father's opinion on the matter definitively. The clan head simply stroked his chin. He invited you into his home, did he? How bold. Not a poor choice of acquaintance based upon what I'm hearing. I see no issue given that you arrived home on time, he replied. Hinata's entire body went numb with excitement, which she was then forced to suppress forcibly to maintain her composure. I am glad, father, thank you for understanding, she said with a short bow. Hai nodded and stood to his feet. As he moved to exit the side room, he glanced over his shoulder at his daughter. Before you ask at a later date, yes, I'm well aware of who Naruto Uzumaki is and what his social status is. Unlike you, I also know why. Luckily for you, I'm also of the unpopular opinion that he's harmless. Do with him what you please. Just adhere to your curfew, he said before stepping away and going on his way. After a few moments of self-grant, Hinata stood to her feet and allowed a smile to creep across her lips. A week ago, I was stuck. Now you're within reach, Naruto-kun. Uruka raised an eyebrow as he made his way into the classroom. Things were, for the most part, as they usually were. Shikamaru Nara was out cold. Sasaki Uchi was the physical embodiment of darkness, and Choji Akamaiki was 3/4 of the way through a family-sized bag of chips. The only thing about the scene he had just entered into that stood apart from the daily average was a subtle shift in positioning from one student in particular. Instead of sitting a seat to the left of Sasaki, Naruto was now sitting in the upper left corner of the room to the left of Hinata Hyuga. The sight forced the instructor to suppress a laugh. Hinata was clearly over the moon at the new development, and Naruto was seemingly unaware of it. Her cheeks were practically glowing red, her lips were pulled into a shy smile, and her eyes were routinely drifting in his direction. No concerted efforts to disguise her sentiments whatsoever, and previous occasions suggested that she was entirely incapable of any kind of subtlety. Despite it all, Nar remained uninformed. At that thought, Uraruka sighed and shook his head. You'd be smart to catch on, Nar. You've got the richest girl in town pining for you, he thought to himself. Once he had moved on from that line of thinking, Uruka began instruction. The schedule was fairly lax by normal standards, as 2 of the usual 4 classes had been turned to study periods due to the expected arrival of the Hokage for a meeting with the instructors during the corresponding hours. In spite of that fact, Oraruka instructed as he always did, slowly, concisely, and as engagingly as was possible with a group of reactive 12-year-olds. Throughout the first of the 2 classes set to take place that day, the instructor spent much of his subconscious energy on observing Hinata. Her unexpected interest in the boy now sitting next to her had been obvious to Uruka for several years by this point. In fact, he likely could have charted the stages by which the heiress fixation had developed. Initially, she did little more than smile at his often obscene attempts at humor. From there, that smile developed into suppressed giggles. Eventually, she began to steal glances at him from across the room. As time went on, those glances developed into prolonged gazes of longing. Fortunately or unfortunately, Hinata was much unlike her kin. She was blatantly lacking in social confidence, quite awkward, and extremely shy. The negatives of this reality were obvious. Those traits prevented her from ever taking legitimate steps to engage with Naruto, who was unlikely to be socially aware enough to take notice of anybody who didn't simply slap him in the face. Beyond that, her timid demeanor limited her ability to properly converse with him to begin with. On the positive end, her natural disposition for gentleness was far more compatible with Naruto's confrontational personality. All of the stages of development seemed to have led up to the current situation she seemed to be in. While not entirely certain, Uruka's intuition and observation pointed to a shift in the dynamic between the pair. Had it been several months prior, Hinata would have likely been unconscious after 30 minutes of being in fairly close quarters with Nar. But now, she was as close to calm as she likely could be in his presence. She still found ways to stare throughout class, but she was holding herself together in a way Uruka had not thought possible. He almost felt proud of her as he dismissed the class for their 10-minute intermission between first and second hour. The final class before lunch hour was much the same as the first. Uruka instructed in standard fashion, occasionally glancing at the pair of interest off in the corner. One particular occurrence during the second hour, however, was quite humorous. During a daily quiz, which the students had been warned of the previous day, Uruka had opted to patrol the room in order to prevent cheating from taking place. As he passed by Hinata, he caught sight of her notebook. The pages were filled with 2 things: class notes and small smiling sketches of Naruto's face, many of which were rimmed with hearts. Despite his best efforts, Uruka couldn't help but chuckle to himself as he walked by. If the look on her face as he passed was any indication, she was no fool. On some level, Uruka felt a degree of guilt for embarrassing her in such a way. But as a whole, she had put herself at risk by exposing the pages to begin with. If anything, she was lucky that Nar was blissfully unaware of the world around him 80% of the time. A simple glance to his right would lay Hinata's not-so-well-kept secret bare. Once the second hour had concluded, the students flocked out into the outside property of the academy to eat their meals. On a hunch, Uruka decided to observe the student body from the roof of the building. What he saw confirmed said hunch. Nar was seated across from Hinata at a picnic table underneath the shade of a nearby tree. Well, now that's definitely a good thing. Both of them could use a friend, Uruka thought to himself with a smile. As he watched them, another presence appeared on the roof behind the instructor. Good afternoon. Uruka glanced back over his shoulder to identify his new roof. Once he had put a name to the face of the man, the instructor whipped around and bowed low. Hokage-sama, I didn't expect you to arrive so early, he said respectfully as Hiruzen joined him at the edge of the roof. The old man stared out over the small yard and then looked back to Uruka. At ease, Uruka. No need to be so formal. We aren't in a professional setting quite yet, he said. At his words, the Chunin relaxed and straightened his posture once again. Is there any particular reason you've decided to be so early? My lord, he asked. The Hokage gestured out to the children below, who had still yet to notice the pair observing them from above. I enjoy watching the next generation. A healthy variety of personalities in this year's bunch, don't you think? He replied. Uruka nodded and scratched the back of his head. That's an understatement if I've ever heard one. It can be a little overwhelming on the worst of days, honestly. All in all, though, I still enjoy this job, he said. Hizen chuckled to himself and straightened his traditional hat. I'm glad to hear it. There are few men with the patience required to instruct young ones for as long as you have. This year in particular has been fascinating to read student reports on. Lots has happened from the sounds of it, he said. The instructor laughed a bit, I guess. So, nothing too terrible, which is good. Naruto's jokes can be a little distracting, but none of them are destructive, and Shikamaru clocking in more hours of sleep in a single week than I have in the last year has honestly become endearing, he said humorously. Uruka then noticed that Hirazen's gaze was focused on one particular part of the yard below them. You've noticed it, haven't you? He asked the elderly leader. Hai nodded and kept his eyes on Naruto and Hinata, who were engaged in something resembling a conversation. Do you have the faintest idea of how this came to be? He asked. The instructor shook his head and sighed. I spent most of today trying to figure that out. She's been head over heels for him for at least 2 years by my estimation, and he's been too nearsighted to notice. On top of that, she's a social dunce. Something wild must have happened, he admitted. The Hokage smiled as Hinata appeared to laugh happily at a remark made by her blonde companion. Or they were simply put into a situation that required them to interact. Given their respective personalities, it wouldn't take much for the two of them to become friendly with one another, he suggested. Uruka furrowed his eyebrows and considered the possibility. I doubt that honestly. Nar has spoken to her before. He even told me once that she was weird and gloomy, he pondered. Hai stifled a laugh. He isn't exactly wrong. She does very little other than stare at him from what I've gathered from the student reports. That's a little bit strange. Even you have to admit. She's a sweet girl behind all of that, but you'd be hard-pressed to figure that out just by watching her, he pointed out. There was then a spell of silent observation. After a minute or two, Hisan spoke once again. I do hope that this seeming friendship holds and develops. Nar hasn't been in the best place of late. He needs support from people other than you and I right now, he said, his tone both hopeful and regretful. Uruka eyed the old man skeptically. What's the problem? I know he's had issues with self-loathing in the past, but he's gotten over them pretty quick, he asked. The Hokage pursed his lips and exhaled through his nose. I think he's starting to piece together what exactly he is, if you know what I mean, he replied. Uruka winced and glanced back at Nar, who was eating a rice ball Hinata had given to him. Yeah, do it. Do you think it's starting to speak to him? He asked. Hai stared straight ahead and pulled at the sides of his robes to adjust them. I certainly hope not. He isn't mentally strong enough to stave him off yet. Not that outright possession has ever been a trademark. Still though, I worry, he said. Hai then sighed. A depressing note to end on, but I think we should prepare for the meeting, he said tiredly. Uruka nodded in agreement and disappeared into a puff of smoke to begin preparations. Now alone on the roof, Hisan cast one last glance towards the pair of unpopular children. I don't know if you're fully prepared to delve into what you may or may not discover about him, Hinata, but I wish you the best of luck. Hinata smiled with satisfaction as she examined the origami bird she had made for herself. It had taken roughly 10 minutes, which was a personal record for the young Hyuga. It was far from elaborate, but it was clear in shape and identity. As she admired her work, her seatmate glanced to his right and turned his attention away from the notes he had decided to attempt to understand. Did you make that? He asked curiously. Hinata flinched at his sudden question, but quickly pulled herself back together and nodded. She then presented the bird to him proudly. Why, yes, I did. It isn't perfect, but I think I did well, she said humbly. Nar examined the craft for a few moments before replying. Yeah, that's really good. It actually looks like a bird. Last time I tried something like that, I just ended up getting paper cuts, he said. Hinata responded by unfolding the bird and laying it out on the desk in front of them. Nar frowned. Doesn't that take a lot of work? He asked. The heiress shrugged her shoulders and slowly began to recreate the animal with the paper. Maybe, but IW want to show you how to make it. We can't have you cutting yourself, can we? She explained with a smile. The blonde laughed a bit. Yeah, guess not. Try to go slow. I'm done with this kind of thing, he admitted. Hinata shook her head and went through the bird making process step by step. Nonsense. All you need is practice, Naruto_, she assured him. Over the next several minutes, she slowly reconstructed the origami as Naruto watched intently. Once she was finished, she said it in front of Nar. Okay, finished. Why your turn? Do your best to make it the W I did, she urged him. Nar eyed the paper for a few moments before going to work. It took only a few moments for Hinata to spot a mistake. His small screw-up invoked a habit Hinata had developed while teaching her sister the very same concept. She reached out, took hold of Naruto's hands and began to guide them through the steps. Fold it to the L left. Nar_N, not the right. She corrected as she moved his hands to fix the blunder. It was the rare twinge of red on Naruto's cheeks that snapped Hinata back to reality. She immediately pulled her hands away and turned pink. Forgive me. Just a habit. It won't happen again, she murmured awkwardly. A few moments passed in which nothing was said, sending Hinata's confidence spiraling downwards. After a few minutes, however, she felt a tap on her shoulder. The contact caused her to glance up from her lap. Did I do it right? Nar, who was holding up a near-perfect replica of the origami bird, asked hopefully. Hinata shook herself of her stress and examined the craft, finding no visible flaws. Excellent work, Narokan. It looks pristine. She praised him with renewed joviality. Nar grinned and admired his handiwork. You set me on the right track, so you deserve some credit, he said. The ice glanced down at his hands and then back to her own. Why you aren't angry that I touched your hands without your consent? She asked. Nurid frowned and shook his head. No, why would I be? You were helping me, he replied. Hinata relaxed slightly and released the breath she had been holding. Deciding it would be best for her body temperature to change topics, Hinata asked a question. Why did you decide to sit with me today? She asked. Before the blonde could open his mouth to answer, the young Hyuga hastily spoke again. And that I mind. I'm quite pleased. Really, she added quickly. The moment she had finished the sentence, she mentally kicked herself for the second half of the statement. Well, you're kind of my only friend, so I figured I should sit near you. That way, I have somebody to talk to, Naruto said honestly. A wave of mixed emotions washed over Hinata at his response. On one hand, she felt elation at his reference to her as a friend, but on the other, a great deal of sadness at the fact that she was his only confidant and companion. Well, why you're absolutely welcome to sit in near me. Please never hesitate to do so. She replied as firmly as she could. Naruto's expression softened slightly. Thanks for that, Hinata. I appreciate it. Not sure why you're being so nice to me, but I'm not complaining, he said a bit more quietly. Hinata gazed at him and fought the urge to touch his face. I could give you the longest list of reasons imaginable. You wonderful boy, she thought to herself as Naruto gathered himself once again. But not yet, not quite yet, she concluded. At the conclusion of that thought, the final bell of the day rang out through the halls to signal the end of instruction. The noise prompted both children to stand up and gather their things. It was fortunate for the pair that much of the class, save for one Shikimaru Nara, had decided to study either on the roof or in the hallway, as very little of their conversation had been whispered. Once they had both accounted for their supplies, Naruto posed a question. Wanna grab something to eat? I'll pay, he asked. Hinata, much to her own surprise, was able to contain her urge to fall unconscious. After a brief consideration of her curfew, she happily nodded her head. Yes, tea, that would be wonderful. Thank you for the invitation, she said. Nar grinned and gestured for her to follow him out of the room. Once they entered the hall, Hinata sighed to herself. I have a feeling that I know exactly where we're going. Nei glanced at his uncle as they silently made their way through the wooded training grounds of Konoha. It was late, nearly midnight, and they had been walking for nearly 20 minutes. Without any prior warning, Hiyashi had awoken his nephew from his sleep and ordered him to follow without question. Despite his exhaustion, Neji knew better than to complain. The true test of his self-control was controlling his urge to ask the obvious question of why. Seemingly reading his mind, the clan head looked to him and sighed. All of your questions will be answered in 60 seconds, he assured him tiredly. Neji nodded and continued his trek alongside the man. As Hiyashi had predicted, it was not a full minute until they came to a stop at the edge of a clearing. The open space was a long abandoned drilling field, and it was occupied by a single person. Naruto Uzumaki, who was without a shirt, was striking a vertical log in a rhythm. So, we came out here because why? Neji asked skeptically. The clan head responded by pointing across the clearing to the opposite side. Use your eyes, Neji, he ordered him. The boy nodded and allowed his dojutsu to manifest, veins and all. Once his eyes were focused, he looked where he had been instructed to. Cleverly hidden 3 branches up a tree was Hinata. She, from the looks of it, was also observing Naruto from afar, just as they had been for the past 30 seconds. Well, that's certainly interesting. What reason could she possibly have to be out here, especially at this hour, Neji mused. Hai gestured to the sweating blonde in the center of the clearing. That boy would be why. She's been taking chances, slipping away at night to watch him condition himself for the past 8 months, he explained. Neji raised an eyebrow and turned his attention to Nar. After a few seconds of careful observation, the branch Hyuga snickered. He certainly does have very little fat on him. Perhaps she's at that age, he suggested jokingly. Hayashi cleared his throat uncomfortably and shifted in place. That may be part of it. Yes, but I suspect there are other reasons as well, he replied. Neji studied his cousin and Naruto simultaneously in order to decipher the odd situation. Have you a theory, uncle? he asked. The older man nodded his head, though his expression lacked certainty. According to company, Hinata ate a late meal with him before returning home this afternoon. Simple logic says that she's enamored with him, he replied. Neji frowned. True enough, but that doesn't answer the question at hand. Unless she's bored enough to be out here for nothing more than some pleasant, shall we say, scenery. There's little to draw from here, he pointed out. Hai stroked his chin. I'm beginning to think that she sees him as some sort of role model. For all of his lack of polish, he certainly is trying quite hard to perfect the single combination he's hit that log with 1,000 times. And based upon what I've heard from cooler-headed individuals, he's quite intuitive when forced to solve a problem, he pondered. Neji raised an eyebrow. It sounds to me like you've been asking around, he said. The clan head chuckled and motioned for Neji to follow him away from the clearing. A tad, but only in the last day. Any interest of my daughter's is an interest of mine, as you well know, he said. The branch Hyuga glanced back at the clearing and furrowed his eyebrows. Are we not retrieving her? He asked. Hai shook his head and continued on back towards the Hyuga estate. There's no need to incite such chaos. She'd be more than a little bit miffed by our intervention, he replied. Neji nodded and jogged to catch up with his uncle. She can be quite intimidating when angered. Hinata smiled to herself as she breathed in the fresh morning air. It was a weekend and she was finally free to wander about as she pleased. Her curfew still applied on such days, but with an extra hour extended on the end. At present, it was hardly past 7 in the morning, and she had awoken earlier than usual. Preferring to start off her daily endeavors early rather than continuing to sleep in, the girl had taken her time in dressing and cleaning herself before setting out into the village. It had been roughly 8 days since the beginning of her strange but functional companionship with Naruto Uzumaki, and her moods had been nearly twice as positive for it. Things weren't quite close or intimate enough to truly fulfill her years-long desire of being romantically involved with the blonde. But for the first time, things actually seemed to be progressing in that direction. In the 3 instruction F-filled days that had passed since Hinata had inadvertently crossed the physical boundary of contact when assisting Naruto in the making of an origami bird, they pair had remained seated next to one another. Wonderful as it was, however, it did force the Hyuga girl to be quite careful with certain things. Gazing at him was far more difficult when he was a mere 2 feet from her, and the drawings in her notebook needed to be routinely hidden. She had also had the infuriating misfortune of witnessing the subtle damage the disrespect and jeers of their classmates inflicted on Nar. It was difficult to notice for the most part, but there were small things that changed whenever a jab was thrown his way. For the briefest of moments, his face would fall, his body would tense, and an almost imperceptible sigh would escape him. It would all vanish in an instant, but it was always there just below the surface. On one such occasion, Hinata had unconsciously reached out and grasped his hand underneath their desk. She had realized what she was doing when he accepted the gesture and squeezed her noticeably smaller palm. The moment had been both selfishly gratifying and incredibly sad. On one side of things, Hinata had accomplished a thing she had always wished to do, that being to hold onto his hand for no reason other than a desire to do so. But on the other, it had been a depressing revelation of just how much Naruto needed support. He was an excellent actor from a distance, but up close, his pain was visible at nearly all times. These memories brought Hinata mixed emotions, but as a whole, she was glad to have seen what she had seen. One day, I'll get up the nerve to make you understand how wrong they all are. You're my sunlight, she thought to herself, kicking a stone aside as she walked along the dirt street. The heiress had half a mind to seek Naruto out at his apartment, where he likely still was given that it was still the earlier hours of the morning, but she decided against it. For as much progress as she had made in finally becoming a confirmed friend of his, it still felt intrusive to seek him out in such a way. Then another idea sprang into her mind just as she was rounding a corner to reach her destination. Perhaps I could bring him home with me one of these days. He'd be guaranteed a meal that way, and father seems to be accepting or at least neutral toward him. Neji Nisan is a mystery, but I suppose he has no real reason to dislike Naruto-kun, she pondered. A few moments after these considerations, Hinata entered a small cafe which she had been seeking throughout her walk. The small bell atop the door rang at her entrance, notifying the 3 active employees to her arrival. The AYS gave them all a smile and a wave before searching for a table at which to situate herself. After a brief scan of the room, she spotted a familiar face. Uruka-sensei, she called to her teacher who was sitting in the corner of the cafe with a cup of coffee in his left hand. The man glanced up from the book he was reading and smiled jovially, motioning for her to join him. Taking the invitation gratefully, Hinata quickly walked across the establishment and sat down across from Uruka. Good morning, Hinata. What brings you here? Breakfast, I assume, the instructor inquired as the AYS made herself comfortable in her seat. She gave a nod and politely ordered a glass of water from the waitress. Yes, but I'm going to wait a bit before eating. She replied. Uruka set his book aside and studied his shy student for a few moments. You've had a new partner in class the last few days, he said vaguely, letting Hinata put together the verbal puzzle herself. Once she did, her face turned a light pink color. Oh, I suppose S is so. He sat by me earlier this week, so I've been as friendly as I can be. IQ quite enjoy the C company. Really? She said awkwardly. Her teacher chuckled a bit at her clear discomfort at the top of Naruto Uzumaki. Maybe I'm out of line by saying this, but I've got a hunch you've been waiting for a chance to be that nearby to him for quite a while. He said, causing Hinata to lean another shade darker. She then started habitually poking her index fingers together. Am I really that obvious? She asked quietly, clearly quite embarrassed by the prospect of her affection for the blonde being common knowledge. Uruka sighed sympathetically. You stare at him daily. You blush every time he talks, and your notebook is full of heart-rimmed drawings of him. You're a walking heartache, Hinata, he said honestly. The heiress leaned her face on her palm dejectedly and groaned slightly. I can't help how lovable he is. A minus at least. I don't have much competition, she muttered, her tone saddening quite a bit at the last half of the statement. Her instructor tilted his head to one side. How did the two of you get involved? I've seen you having lunch with him, too. I really appreciate you being so kind to him, but I'd still like to know how this started, he asked curiously. Hinata collected herself and took a deep breath. It was a fairly simple thing to recall, but the emotions it had invoked in her were still quite powerful. On the day where Ua asked us to write down the person we would most like to spend last hours with, Yuji gave in Naruto cleaning duty as AP punish Mnet. I forgot my tea things and came back to get them. She began taking a sip of her recently delivered glass of ice water in between. Speaking of which, there were two people who didn't turn in their slips for that activity. One of them was definitely Nar, so there's still a mystery slip. Was that you? Or asked as she finished her small consumption of water. Once she was done, Hinata nodded reluctantly. Why yes, I was paranoid that he would find out somehow, she said melly. Uruka smirked and leaned across the table. You wrote down Naruto's name, didn't you? He asked, well aware that he was exactly right. I did, and I meant it wholeheartedly. I also felt like nobody else was going to write his name. As you know, I have anxiety problems and Jay just couldn't follow through. Hinata replied somewhat ashamedly. Uruka leaned back into his chair. He would have been less likely to find out if you had turned it in. Actually, he never would have seen it. You keeping it increased the chances of him catching sight of his name on your slip, he explained. The Haug girl looked puzzled for a brief moment, but quickly recognized the logic behind the man's line of thinking. When she did, her eyes widened with panic at a mistake she had made. I actually left my tea things in the classroom that day. That's why I returned to find Naruto-kun cleaning. Do you think he saw? She asked quietly. Her instructor thought for a moment before giving an indecisive shrug, indicating that he did not have a concrete answer to her question. At this, Hinata pursed her lips and considered something. If he did see, do you think he would even know how to react? Would he react at all? He pondered. Uruka drummed his fingers on the wooden table pensively. It was a pertinent question, though one that seemed to be without an answer at present. He's still capable of feeling things, Hinata. He'd definitely have a reaction if he saw, but maybe not one that would make a ton of sense to you. If I had to guess, he'd have been more confused than anything else. Other than myself and Hokage-sama, he's more or less on his own. I don't think he's ever really considered the idea that somebody could be interested in him the way you are. Not that I can blame him. He's never been given any reason to think that kind of thing is even on the table for him, he replied. The ice took another sip from her glass of water and sighed. That makes sense. It's also very sad. I just don't understand why people are so cruel to him. Sure, he's a little loud sometimes, but he's really quite wonderful when you actually talk to him. Very sweet person really, she said, her voice growing more quiet the longer she spoke. Uruka's expression softened. I'm glad you feel that way, but the reasons for people treating him the way they do have nothing to do with his personality. It's all because of something he had no way to control, something he didn't ask to be associated with. Frankly, your classmates probably aren't aware of it either. Most of them were told by their parents to avoid or shun him with no context. Kids are cruel and they tend to take things further than they should. Sadly, Naruto's been feeling that reality since the day he learned to speak, he said depressingly. Much to his surprise, Hinata did not react with shows of sadness or shock. Instead, she clenched her jaw and curled her hands into fists. So that's it. They're just using him as a doormat for the fun of it. Cruel wretches, the lot of them. She hissed darkly. Uruka flinched and did a double take. It was foolish to think that even the sweetest people lacked the capacity for darker thoughts, but it was still surprising to see such a shift in demeanor from Hinata. He then recalled back to a memory from the previous year, a prelude to what he was seeing now. In a way, Naruto, for all that his tardiness was common, hardly ever missed class entirely. He tended to show up, if a little late most of the time. The year beforehand, however, he had been forced to stay away from the academy for the entirety of a school week due to sickness. From Monday to Thursday, the majority of the class had found great humor in mocking a variety of things about the blonde in his absence, anything from his poor testing scores to his lack of well-ironed clothing. By this point, Uraruka was aware of Hinata's fascination and dedication to Nar, but he had not truly known the extent of it until the Friday of that week. At the end of every week, there was an hour of hand-to-hand sparring. That week had been no different, with students being randomly selected to face one another in short matches. Hinata, after having been silent at the repeated slander of Naruto, was paired with the worst perpetrator in Sakura Haruno. Ururuka had known that it was a mismatch when he had drawn the names, as Hinata was far and away the most skilled taijutsu practitioner in the class in spite of her shyness. He had fully expected Hinata to outclass her. What he had not expected was for the eyes to take her time comprehensively battering the poor girl. She kicked her legs to shreds, drove knees into her gut, snapped her head back with punches and palm strikes, and eventually kicked her in the neck to knock her halfway out. It was a beating, a brutal one, the message had been clear. To Uraruka, at least Naruto Uzumaki was not to be mocked or belittled. Not in the presence of Hinata Hyuga. Funnily enough, she had returned to her meek ways and habits immediately upon returning to her seat. It was quite clear that release of anger was foreign to her. Returning back to the present, Uraruka intently watched Hinata regain her composure and collect herself. I understand how you feel. It isn't right, but it's also unavoidable. Tragedy breeds fear, which breeds hate. Nar was just unlucky enough to be the recipient. But people like you, and I know how false all of that is, the instructor said. The heiress frowned and furrowed her brow. Something he had just said had bothered her. What do you mean tragedy? What does such a thing have to do with a Naruto? She asked skeptically, realizing he had likely said a bit too much. Ururuka glanced around the cafe and then back to his student. It's not my place to say, and I wouldn't suggest asking around. All you need to know is that it isn't his fault and it never will be. He said vaguely, his tone making it clear that he was unwilling to expand on the topic any further. Hinata then stood up from the table. Do you think he's awake? Why yet? She asked. Uruka shrugged his shoulders and finished the last of his drink. No clue. He could be. He usually is by 7:30 on weekdays, but weekends are a wild card. Only one way to find out for sure, he replied with a wink. Hinata needed no further prompting. She thanked the waitress with a polite bow and quickly exited the cafe. As he watched her leave through the glass siding of the restaurant, Uraruka chuckled to himself. Weird girl, but probably what Nar needs. She won't press him too hard, but she won't let him get away with trying to isolate himself. And when push comes to shove, she'll defend him violently, apparently. He thought to himself. Footsteps then caught his attention. Would you like to order something, sir? The instructor looked to the waitress and thought for a moment, giving a nod after considering his self-imposed monthly budget. Sure, I'll take some ramen if you have it. Nar grinned proudly as he held up his yet unfinished creation. It was about halfway completed, and it would likely take him several more hours to full finish given his current level of skill and polish. But the final result would be worth the struggle. Waking up before 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning was far from standard for the blonde. But when there was work to be done, he had found that doing it earlier rather than later was far more practical. He had even taken the time to shower. There had been no assignments given out by the academy for the 2-day break they were afforded each week, which was a rarity. He had no plans for the following 2 days beyond his basic routines of exercise, which almost always took place at night. Seemingly in direct correlation with the wide-open nature of the coming days, he received an unexpected knock on his door as he observed his small project. At the sound, he flinched and glanced at the door. It was still somewhat early, and a visit was unusual. The list of possible candidates for who it could possibly be also consisted of less than 5 people. Putting away his small project in a kitchen drawer for the time being, Naruto walked to the door. When he opened it, he was met by a surprising but not unwelcome sight. Standing just outside his door frame, looking classically nervous was Hinata. She looked as she always did with her slightly oversized jacket and generally clean appearance, but she was also standing a tad straighter than usual. She still lacked anything resembling outward confidence, but it was a start. Figuring that it would be a mercy to the terminally awkward heiress to begin formalities himself. Naruto was the first to speak. Didn't expect anybody this early. Morning, Hinata. He greeted her with a jovial smile. The heiress bowed politely and returned the smile. Forgive my early intrusion. I simply wanted to see you. I be been given a day to myself by my father. She said, earning a blank look from Nar. So, you aren't here to give me something I forgot or anything like that? He asked skeptically. Hinata shook her head and glanced around uncomfortably. And no, nothing of the sort. Is that a problem? You understand if it is? She replied. The blonde scratched the back of his head and shrugged. No, there's nothing wrong with that. I just wasn't expecting it. I don't really have anything I was planning on doing. So we can do something if you want, he said, stepping aside to wordlessly invite the girl inside. Hinata gladly accepted the silent invitation and stepped into his apartment. Once she was inside, she took the liberty of closing the door herself. Actually, I'd just like to spend some time with you. Perhaps all of tea today if you'll let me, she said. Taken aback by the proposal, Naruto looked on in confusion as Hinata's face gained color under his gaze. If you want to be my guest, I'm probably not going to do anything all that fun today. Just exercise and some walking. Might get ramen later, too. Nothing super interesting, he said. Still not fully understanding why exactly the heiress was insistent on accompanying him. I don't care. As long as we can talk and be enamored as firmly as she could without her voice breaking from her nerves. Deciding that attempting to unravel her logic was pointless, the blonde made his way to his couch and sat down, prompting Hinata to follow him. When she arrived at the piece of furniture, though she stopped, seemingly stuck on something. I already ate breakfast, so if you want something to eat, there's probably cup ramen in the fridge. Naruto said, momentarily oblivious to her struggle. When she didn't answer him, he glanced up at her and frowned slightly. Hey, you alright? You look kind of lost, he said as the Hyuga girl simply stared at him in a stupor. His words shook her from the seeming trance. And no, I don't need anything to eat. I was just wondering, is it okay if I sit next to you on the couch? She asked shyly. Nar glanced down at the couch he was sitting on and nodded. Yeah, why wouldn't it be? That's kind of why I sat here, way more comfortable than the table, he replied after a moment of self-gathering. Hinata gingerly seated herself next to Nar on the couch as far from him as was possible. Thank you for your hospitality, Nar she said gratefully as she made herself comfortable. Nar nodded and stretched his upper body for a few seconds. Be honest with me. Is it actually okay for me to be sitting next to you in class and stuff? I saw some people giving you weird looks when you left class yesterday. That's normal for me, but they've never looked at you that way before, he asked. The ice furrowed her eyebrows at this. Of course it is. I could care less if they judge me for being near Wu. The men not appreciating Wu is their loss, she said with a look of concern. The blonde picked at a stray seam on his shirt. Thank you, but also I just don't know if it's good for you. Your family is super famous. If people see you hanging around with me, couldn't that get you guys a bunch of flack? He asked. Hinata shook her head. That doesn't matter at all to me. Simply spending time WWTHU isn't going to tar down the reputation of the Hyuga. Besides, my father doesn't mind me being around US, so the rest of the clan has no say regardless. She assured him. The blonde shifted his gaze away from her and down to the floor. I've never even met your dad. How would he know anything about me? He pointed out. Hinata thought back to her conversation with Iruka at the cafe, more specifically to the information regarding Naruto's treatment that she had learned. Most adults in the village seem to know who you are, and father is very well informed. He clearly knows enough to understand that there's nothing wrong with my desire to be around you, she said. Her classmate gave no response. Sensing that words were hardly the easiest route to getting her point across, given both her awkwardness and Naruto's inability to accept or understand her genuine appreciation for him, Hinata swallowed her fear and scooted herself across the couch to close the gap between them. With her heart practically pounding a hole in her chest, the eyes leaned her weight on him and rested her head on his shoulder. The contact immediately snapped Naruto to attention. He slowly turned his head to look at her, causing their eyes to meet as Hinata looked at him from his shoulder. Now I'm not sure how he'd feel about Mel leaning on UT this way, but that would apply to anybody. And not just you. You're a perfectly acceptable and delightful boy, Naruto, she said softly. Slowly but surely, the rigidness drained out of Naruto's body as he silently accepted her sentiment. Why are you being so kind to me? We barely talked at all before this week, and now you're making me feel worth something. Why? He asked quietly. Hinata gently squeezed his arm, which she had carefully attached herself to. I always thought you were worth is something more than just something actually lots. I just never knew how to engage with you. I'm versus very nervous and awkward in general, but especially around you, she said, kicking herself mentally for the awful verbal screw-up she had suffered at the end. Why are you scared of me or something? Nar inferred. Hinata sighed and closed her eyes to enjoy a level of contact with him she had only ever dreamt of previously. If I were afraid of you, I wouldn't be pressed up against your body. Why doesn't matter right now? Just know that I appreciate you and Narutkin, she said warmly. The blonde shifted a bit but did not make any move to change their current situation. Okay, I guess I'm glad you're not scared of me. It would suck if my only friend was afraid of me, he said. Hinata nodded, but she was hardly listening to him anymore. She was completely taken by the glee she felt being fully latched onto him with no resistance. As such, the pair sat in silence for a few moments. Eventually, Naruto spoke, can we stay like this for a while? It's warm and feels nice. He asked innocently, more than happy to oblige. The AYS nodded, causing her hair to rub against his cheek lightly. Of course, Narukin. Nar stretched his sore body thoroughly and sat himself down at the base of a tall, lively tree. He was tired, sweaty, and extremely hungry. It was a few minutes past 5 o'clock, and the blonde's day had been nothing if not dull. Mondays tended to be, as the return to the academy was never pleasant after 2 whole days of freedom, but today in particular had been incredibly uninteresting. Classes were slow, Ururuka was strict, and the hours had dragged on longer than a trek across the desert. Nothing of note happened. Regardless, the most engaging part of his day was now over, that being his daily conditioning. He had run a lap around the village, completed 3 sets of 75 push-ups, drilled his progressing, albeit sloppy, taijutsu, and partaken in a number of other exercises. The entire process had taken him roughly 2 hours to complete, and he was exhausted. The fact that it was nearly 90 degrees didn't help either. The August heat was blistering, and it refused to relent. It made it fairly difficult for Naruto to motivate himself to exercise, but he still worked as he always did. It was a way to pass time and a way to ready himself for life as a shinobi. Finally giving into the high temperature somewhat, Nar removed his shirt and tossed it aside. The moment the garment was gone, he felt a great degree of physical relief. He was far less overheated with a bare upper body. Coinciding with his sigh of satisfaction, however, was an odd squeaking noise from nearby and to his left. Raising an eyebrow and glancing in the direction from which the sound had come, the blonde stood to his feet and slowly walked over towards another tree, hearing the sounds of shifting sticks and leaves behind it. Nar stepped around the base of the tree and looked down at what lay behind it. Sitting against the trunk of the tree with her knees drawn up to her chin and a face red as a cherry was Hinata. She looked as though she had been situated in that very spot for a number of minutes, and she looked quite shaken for reasons unknown to the blonde. His arrival on her side of the tree alerted the chronically nervous girl to his presence, causing her to flinch and slowly turn her eyes up to look at him. So, what brings you here? Nar asked curiously. Hinata took an inordinately long time to respond as she seemed entranced for some odd reason as she stared up at him. After a full 60 seconds, Naruto cleared his throat. Hinata, he pressed, quite puzzled by her silence and odd facial expression. His words brought her back to reality, and when they did, she gasped and scooted several feet away from him. I was just enjoying the scenery. Lovely day, don't you think? She stuttered back with wide eyes and burning cheeks. It was a lie. That much was obvious even to the usually socially inept blonde. Taking a moment to consider possibilities, Naruto laughed when he found what he felt to be the most likely. Were you watching me, Hinata? He asked humorously. Though she fumbled for a response for a bit, the heiress eventually sighed and hung her head. Why, yes, she muttered dejectedly, clearly expecting to be beard for having spied on the outcast boy. Satisfied with her honesty, Nar sat down in front of her and smiled. Well, if you wanted to talk or hang out, you should have just asked. Not like I have a ton to do. You're about as fun as it gets for me, he said with a grin. Hinata glanced up from the ground and let her eyes linger a little below his face. I'm just very bad at engaging it. Makes me nervous. With you specifically. Very, she said quietly. The blonde shrugged his shoulders and wiped some sweat from his forehead. Still don't really get why, but you never have to be nervous around me, Hinata. You can just come and get me if you need stuff or want to do something. I'm pretty much always available, he said reassuringly. Hinata relaxed somewhat, but still remained quite embarrassed looking. You follow me around a lot, don't you? The blonde asked. The heiress gave a brief nod and began poking her index fingers together as she typically did in uncomfortable situations. Nothing weird. I just like to keep an eye on you sometimes. Why? You know, she said meekly. Naruto cast her an odd look and remained silent for a moment. That kind of is weird though. Nobody's ever really done that before. Not even Uruka-sensei. Why are you doing it? He asked skeptically. Hinata opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again. A long stretch of dead air then passed between them. Neither were particularly sure of what should or could be said, though for entirely different reasons. It wasn't until she had entirely gathered herself that Hinata broke the silence. Because you deserve to be watched over by somebody. Maybe I haven't been helpful, and I probably haven't been since you had no clue until today. But you're more than worth the trouble. You always take care of yourself. And I think you've earned the right to be taken care of by somebody else every once in a while, she said in a shockingly clear, unbroken voice. Nar simply stared at her in response. That's the longest thing I've ever heard you say without stuttering, he said in obvious awe of her confident speech. Hinata turned her head up and looked him in the eyes directly. I think it comes to me when I really need it, too. Which, as it happens, usually pertains to you. Either way, I'll stop following you if you want. Just know that I'm always thinking about you, Naruto_, she said sweetly. The blonde flushed red and blinked. He had not been expecting a speech of that kind in any way at all. It took him a reasonable amount of time to fully grasp what he was being told. I really don't care if you follow me around. Hell, you could always just walk with me. You know, I'll never say no to your company. You make me really happy, he said carefully, averting his eyes away from the girl as he spoke. I know this sounds selfish, but Hinata began, surprising him greatly by reaching out and circling her arms around the back of his neck. The blonde then looked back at her, seeing that her face was now quite close to his own. Could you make me happy? She asked softly with her nose practically touching his. Frozen in his own body, Naruto didn't respond at all. He simply looked on with a confused expression on his face. The Haug girl then leaned her head to the side and inched her lips forward towards his. Just before they could make contact, though, she released him and pulled her head back. What am I doing? She said, more to herself than to Nar. She then stood up to her feet and glanced down at the still puzzled blonde. Forgive me. That was very improper of me. I'll leave Ua alone now. She said before Nar could react or respond. She broke out into a sprint in the opposite direction. Within seconds, she was long gone. Dumbfounded by what had just occurred, Nar slowly rose to his feet and retrieved his shirt. What was that all about? He murmured to no one in particular. Strangely enough, despite his lack of understanding of why Hinata had done much of what she had, he found himself quite disappointed that she had stopped doing what she had been aiming to do. It also concerned him greatly that she had bolted nearly immediately after backing away. Putting his shirt back on and gazing out in the direction Hinata had run, the blonde sighed. Sweet and nice as you are, you're still really weird sometimes, he said to the long girl. Coming to a silent decision, the young ninja to be set out after her. Chances were she had gone to the Hyuga estate. Hiyashi looked up from his newspaper and straightened his posture as Neji entered his study. It was a rare day that Hiyashi's nephew would come to his uncle unsummoned. And when he did, it tended to be for something at least somewhat important. We have a visitor, Hiyashi-sama, he said directly. The clan head set his paper aside and folded his arms across his chest. Do we now? That's certainly unusual, especially given the hour. Who is this visitor? Neji, he inquired. Neji promptly walked out of the room and then down the hall. After a minute or two, he returned with an unexpected face at his side. Naruto Uzumaki, the village pariah, and unlikely subject of his own daughter's admiration. I'll leave this to the two of you. It doesn't concern me. Goodbye and good night. The branch Hyuga said before disappearing out the door and closing it. With the study now sealed off, Hiyashi stood up from his chair. I assumed I would be meeting you sometime soon, but this certainly is a surprise. What business do you have at my home? He asked. The blonde looked quite uncomfortable in the clan head's presence. He had clearly not been expecting to be left alone with Hiyashi so quickly, if at all. As such, he was slow to respond. I kind of want to see Hinata. We were talking around 20 minutes ago, and then some stuff happened. She ran away. I want to see how she's doing. He explained nervously. Hi. Ashi stroked his chin and studied the boy. Back up a few steps, Uzumaki. Explain what stuff happened. Explain the situation so I may better understand the situation at hand, he replied. Naruto's face then gained color, which the older man easily noticed. Once again, the blonde took time to speak. Out with it, boy, it's nearing sundown, and I have dinner to direct. I'm in a fairly pleasant mood, so try not to worry too much about my reaction. I assure you, I won't be as harsh as you're anticipating, I said in the midst of Naruto's indecisiveness. Sorry. Okay. Well, I was out exercising like I always do before I head home for the day, and I decided to be done. While I was sitting down, I heard a noise, so I went to check it out. I found Hinata hiding behind a tree a few feet away from me. He began. At his words, Hiyashi internally winced and fought the urge to visibly grimace. Poor girl. Finally exposed, he thought to himself as Naruto gathered his memories to continue his account of that evening's events. After I found her there, she sort of freaked out, but I calmed her down. After that, she admitted that she had a habit of stalking me or whatever. And after we talked about it a little bit, she said that she'd stop, but also that she was always thinking about me. It was really weird, the blonde explained, his tone growing more conflicted the longer he spoke. I felt a surge of pride for the sake of his daughter. Even if she said no more than that, she probably avoided a heart attack by inches while she said it. Good on her, he thought proudly. Did she run away after expressing that sentiment to you, Uzuki-san? The clan head pressed curiously, earning a surprising shake of the head from Naruto. His interest now peaked. Hiyashi tilted his head to one side and awaited further extrapolation. No, actually I told her that I was fine with her following me around or even just coming out and doing stuff with me if she wanted to. After that, he said, trailing off into silence before he could finish. She what? Uzuki-san, Hiyashi urged him. The blonde fidgeted a bit with his hands and shuffled his feet around. He looked stumped by something. She wrapped her arms around the back of my neck and sort of nuzzled her nose on mine. Then she asked me if I could make her happy. After that, she leaned in a little more. Before she could actually do whatever she was trying to do, she stopped and apologized. Then she ran away. I followed her and now here I am. He concluded once he had sorted out his thoughts. Of all the things I expected to hear, that was definitely not one of them. Given that you have no reason to lie to me, I'm going to believe you. I said. Nar nodded, but did not say a word. You look bothered. You do realize what she was attempting to do, don't you? The clan head inferred. Another nod came from the ninja-to-be. She was trying to kiss me, wasn't she? He asked. She shrugged his shoulders and sat back down in his chair. Almost certainly. I personally don't care if she was or not, but you seem to. Tell me, how would you have reacted if she had followed through and allowed her lips to meet yours? He asked. I don't know. Nobody's ever tried to do that kind of thing to me before, so I've never really thought about how I'd feel if somebody did, you know. Nar said in response. I crossed one leg over the other. Let me frame this another way. Do you think highly enough of my daughter to consider her worthy of kissing you? He clarified. The blonde's response was instant. Are you kidding? She's basically royalty. Of course I do. I'm a huge step down from who she probably should be doing that with, he said firmly. The clan head narrowed his eyes. I'd prefer it if you thought of this question from a perspective free of social standings and titles. As a person, is she appealing enough to kiss in your mind? He corrected. Naruto's face then turned red for a second time. I mean, she's my only friend, and she's been nothing but nice to me since we started doing stuff together. And she's pretty cute, I think. So, yeah, I think she is, he said carefully. Hashi nodded, satisfied with the boy's response. I'm glad your standards are up to par. I won't say too much, but my daughter thinks the world of you. She would be over the moon to know that you hold her in such high regards. I do hope the two of you can work out this issue. It seems you're on the same page emotionally, he said. Nar furrowed his brow. Wait, so you don't care that I hang out with her a lot? He asked hopefully. Hiyashi shook his head and grabbed his newspaper to finish reading it. Not in the least. You aren't popular publicly, but I've never been a trendy or politically correct man opinion-wise. I don't mind you. You're a fine lad as far as I'm concerned, he said. Breathing a sigh of relief, Naruto relaxed. Can I go see her then? I really want to make sure she isn't beating herself up, he requested. Much to his dismay, Hiyashi shook his head. I'm afraid not. Not tonight, anyway. Dinner starts in 20 minutes, and she has a standard to live up to his AYS. Tardiness in particular is taboo in this household. How about this, though? I'll speak with her tonight and do what I can to make sure she doesn't avoid you this week. Does that sound fair? The clan head reasoned. After a moment's consideration, Naruto gave a thumbs up. Yeah, that sounds good. I'll leave you guys alone for now. Thanks for being cool, Hiyashi-sama. He thanked him with a bow before bolting from the study. With Naruto now gone, Hiyashi smiled to himself slightly. I have the strangest feeling that he'll be the death of my sleeping schedule for one reason or another. Hinata removed her face from her pillow and rolled onto her back with the soft mass held fast to her chest. It was nearly time to eat, and she had still not fully regained her composure. Things had been going nearly perfectly for the past 10 days. It had all been wonderfully blissful up until she had taken it a step too far. She had let her emotions and desperate desires take control of her at the exact wrong moment. Things were certain to downgrade from here on out, and it was all due to her own error. What was I thinking? Sure, we snuggled a little bit a few days ago, but that was just platonic, I think. What on earth compelled me to try to kiss him? She mentally scolded herself for the nth time since her arrival back home. As she buried herself within her own mind, the door to her room opened. Not bothering to look to see who it was, the girl simply rolled back onto her stomach and buried her face back into the pillow. I wish to be left alone right now, she said in a muffled voice from within the softness of her pillow. She then felt a weight seat itself at the end of her bed. I understand that, but I figured you'd like to know that Naruto was here only minutes ago, came her father's voice. The mention of the blonde's name brought heat to Hinata's face and a rapid pace to her heartbeat. What did he want? Was he here to admonish about my actions? She asked hopelessly. Her father laid a hand on top of her head gently. He was here to see you. Actually, he wanted to make sure that you weren't tearing yourself down over what occurred between you. Perhaps it isn't my place to tell you this, but he also wasn't offended in the least. A tad confused, but not bothered. He and I eventually worked out that he likely would have reciprocated had you indeed gone through with your plan, he revealed. Hinata removed her face from her pillow again and moved to a sitting position. He told you everything. Ha! How rude of him. She muttered under her breath. I laughed lightly at this. I practically forced him to tell me. It isn't his fault. Regardless, you haven't damaged your chances in any way at all. And yes, I'm aware of what your aim is, and I don't mind it. Still, I think it would be better if you let him decide for himself that he truly wants to belong to you and vice versa, he replied. The heiress drew her knees up to her chin. I don't even know why I was suddenly so compelled to do widen nod normally so forward. She pondered quietly. Her father stood up from her bedside and headed for the door. He's clearly affected you for the better of late. You're infinitely more social than you were, and your student reports for engagement are superb. I'd say this is a good sign. Try not to stress yourself out. Wherever you do not evade him tomorrow. Meet him head on, he said before exiting her room. I'm certainly not going to try to kiss you again, Naruto. Not yet, at least. But maybe I can try other things. Tamer things, Hinata thought to herself once she was alone. After a spell of thinking, she hopped off the bed and stretched. I hope we aren't eating crab again. Hinata waited in the center of the empty lobby pensively. It was quite early in the morning, hardly past 6 o'clock, but such was the schedule of an attendee of Konoha's Ninja Academy. There was a time at which Nar, whose apartment complex Hinata was currently situated within, would simply arrive for class any time before 9 o'clock. This went on for a number of months until he was harshly admonished for his tardiness. Since that day, he had been on time the vast majority of days. He only tended to miss when he was either sick or having some sort of crisis. Both of those things were quite rare, though. Naruto tended to be at the academy when he was expected to be. Hinata herself tended to be in the classroom a number of minutes early each day, usually to finish assignments that she had not had the time to complete at home, but also out of a desire to perhaps muster the courage to greet Nar upon his entrance to the room. She had failed miserably on the second front for years on end until recently, since they were now quite closely involved. As of the present moment, Hinata was working to maintain that closeness. The previous day's blunder on her part had not, according to her father, done any damage to her standing with the blonde, but she had always been one to assure things were right. The past several minutes had been spent watching the staircase from which the eyes knew Naruto would eventually descend to begin his trek to the academy. While she was generally unworried about Naruto's reaction to whatever apology she managed to squeak out, she still much preferred to not have an audience. Luckily, there was no one else present in the lobby at the moment. Not even a receptionist, which was slightly odd. The heiress stood in silence for another 5 minutes, and once that time had elapsed, the sound of footsteps could be heard coming down the stairway. It took another painstaking 10 seconds for the maker of the sounds to reach the bottom. As expected, it was Nar. He was dressed slightly differently than he normally was, as instead of an orange jumpsuit, he was wearing shorts and a black t-shirt with a red swirl in the center of the shirt. A logical adjustment given the warm weather. Once he was fully on the lobby floor, he quickly noticed Hinata. Neither said a word for a few moments, but the silence didn't last for long. Well, at least I don't have to go looking for you now, he joked as he made his way up to her with a friendly smile. His demeanor was a great relief to Hinata right away. There were no signs of ill will or discomfort. He was as he always was, welcoming and open. Were you planning on searching? The heiress asked with a shy laugh. The blonde shrugged his shoulders and rubbed some sleep out of one of his eyes. Mostly a joke, but I would have if you weren't at the academy. Honestly, you're the only thing that keeps me awake in class. Can't end up falling asleep during lessons, he said jovially. Hinata smiled and shifted her grip on her supplies. Well, here I am. Leaving you all alone would be mean of me. Keeping you happy is a pastime of mine these days, she replied. The blonde grinned and walked past her, tapping her on the shoulder he passed to indicate that she should follow him. Doing as she was being silently instructed, Hinata fell into step alongside him as they walked towards the academy. It would likely take somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 minutes to reach the building on foot, meaning they had time to discuss what she had come to discuss with him. After a minute or two of silent travel, the heiress broached the topic. You about yesterday, Naruto-kun, I feel the end need to formally apologize to you. Invading your personal space that way was very rude of me and I promise it will never happen again, she said apologetically, earning a sideways look from Naruto. Don't be like that, Hinata, you could have warned me first, but you didn't do anything wrong. I don't think. Be sorry, you've got no reason to be. Her classmate assured her. Thesis relaxed for the most part and looked to his face, which was now staring straight ahead. Or really you genuinely aren't offended or off put by my sudden forwardness? She asked in a small voice. Nar nodded. Yeah, why would I be? I like you a lot. And your lips look pretty soft to me. It wouldn't have been bad at all. He said somewhat awkwardly. Though his words certainly made himself feel jittery, his reaction could not compare to Hinata's. The moment Naruto's sentence had fully set into her, she turned bright red all the way from her toes to the points of her ears. She attempted to speak, but stopped when she found that it would almost certainly result in her fainting on the spot. The blonde quickly noticed her deep crimson color and panicked slightly. Hinata, are you okay? He asked, his tone a tad frantic. The AYS remained silent, but gave a nod. She then stepped into him and wrapped herself around his arm with a shy smile on her face. Perfectly okay. I feel wonderful, she said quietly after a few moments. At this, the pair continued their walk to their destination. As they went, Hinata couldn't help but notice the confused looks on the faces of the citizens. They looked puzzled by the prospect of Hinata Hyuga, the heir apparent to the mantle of the largest clan in the village, being willingly affectionate towards who they perceived to be a waste of space. It angered her, but she suppressed herself as best she could. Her composure came close to cracking, however, when she caught sight of those looks of confusion turning to ones of hateful resentment. Trying to find herself an anchor of positivity, she looked up at Naruto's face. His expression was blank. It was void of any discernible emotion. He was pushing it all just below the surface. Ignore them. They aren't worth your time. Don't let them influence you. Just keep on being yourself. Naruto-kun, she whispered in his ear, tightening her grip on his arm as she spoke to him softly. He hardly reacted, but he did relax a bit. It wasn't much, but it was a hardening reaction in the eyes of the heiress. The pair soon picked up their pace and made their way out of the more populated section of the district. Once they were in a less crowded area, Naruto spoke. Thanks for that, Hinata. I needed it, he said gratefully. Hinata nodded and smiled to herself with his arm pulled into her chest. She then asked a risky question. Do you know why they seem to resent you? It doesn't make any sense to me. She asked, her stutter returning somewhat. Naruto's expression darkened momentarily, but it returned to neutrality in mere seconds. I've got a few ideas. I'm pretty sure I know, honestly. Just paying attention over the years has given me some hints, he said. Hinata tilted her head to one side and studied him. Could you tell me what think it may be? I judge you. No matter what it is, she asked gently. The same dark look passed over his features once more before he shook his head. I'd rather not. If I'm right, you'd quit being my friend, he said shortly. Hinata frowned at this, but decided not to press any further for the sake of his mood. It would take something truly awful to put me off of you, Naruto_. Your company is what I wake up for, she assured him firmly. Much to her relief, Naruto smiled at this. Soon enough, they arrived at the academy. When they entered the classroom, it was entirely empty. It was still only 6:25, 20 minutes before attendance was to be taken. It was a blessing to both, as the reactions of their classmates to the sight of Hinata so affectionately latched to him would have likely been quite uncomfortable. The only person to catch sight of them as they entered was Iruka, who simply smiled. Nar stretched and leaned back in his chair. It was halfway through the third of 4 instruction periods, and he was incredibly bored. The lessons were always dull, but even more so than usual when they pertained to such things as projectile throwing or trajectory measurement. It all went in one ear and out the other for Nar. In the back of his mind, he knew that the knowledge was likely essential for him to learn in some capacity, but as of now, he found it difficult to pay attention. At present, he was also sitting alone. Hinata had exited the room to discuss a previous assignment with Iruka, and she had yet to return in the 3 minutes since. It was more or less silent in the classroom as the majority of the students were taking the opportunity to relax. The blonde, unlike the rest of the class, was without a person to speak to at the time being. As a result, he was alone with his thoughts as he sat in the upper left corner of the room. With his fingers drumming on the desk absently, the blonde glanced to either side to find anything of note to focus on. To the right, there was nothing but a blandly painted wall. To his left, where Hinata always sat, however, there was indeed something interesting. Left open and somewhat facing him, was the heiress notebook. It was the very same one she used for class notes and such. Eyeing the notebook carefully, the blonde considered the decency of peeking into the girl's personal things for a moment. Eventually, he shrugged to himself and slid the notebook over to himself. Once it was in front of him, he opened it and observed its contents. As expected, it was filled with flawlessly written notes that were detailed and specific to individual topics that had been discussed in class. Her handwriting is perfect figures. He thought to himself as he read the information on the pages. He then began to flip through the pages. They were all completely filled with the same immaculate handwriting and the notebook was fairly thick. There was a massive amount of educational information. Man, I never take notes. And here she is writing a textbook. Nar joked to himself. The more pages he looked over, the paragraphs of notes there were. That was until he reached the final quarter of the notebook. At that point, the writing was replaced with detailed drawings of numerous types of flower. Some of them were only petals and others were entire plants. They were immensely impressive to behold. Yes, I guess her drawings match her handwriting, Nar thought as he marveled at her artistic prowess. He then flipped through a few more pages, eventually stopping on one in particular. His reason for focusing his attention on the page was that the subject matter of the drawings changed from flowers to something else. Something much more unusual from his perspective. Filling 2 whole pages were cartoonish smiling drawings of him. They were drawn in such a way that they were clearly not meant to be realistic, but they were still meticulously created. In the center of it all, spanning across both pages when the notebook was opened all the way, was his first name. It was stylized to be warm-looking as it was the only drawing that was colored in any way. His name was shaded a consistent hue of orange that gradually grew darker with each letter. The most striking thing about the illustration was that his name was rimmed with hearts which were colored red. Naruto Uzumaki was generally speaking considered dense. It was a fair distinction in many cases, but even he wasn't so blind to not realize the implications of what he was seeing. Their encounters had started off quite restrained and quiet, as Naruto had only been obligated to interact with her due to a lack of options when it came to acquaintances. His accidental discovery of his name on her slip had given him some intrigue that kept him engaged with the question of why, but Hinata herself had steadily grown more interesting in and of herself over the past 2 weeks. Her horrid, nervous anxiety had been somewhat frustrating to the blonde at first, but he had grown to find it endearing as it slowly dissipated and improved. Then, as time went on, her awkward ramblings became more focused. Much of the time, they were also purposed to comfort him, lift him up, and make him feel as though he was of value. She never failed to stutter at least a time or two during these speeches, but they always did their job well. She was trying earnestly to be a source of self-confidence for Nar. Come to think of it, you've been getting more and more touchy-feely, too, the blonde thought to himself. As he pondered their past conversations, certain things she had said came back to him. I'm always thinking about you, Naruto. Ignore them. They aren't worth your time. Don't let them influence you. Just keep on being yourself, Naruto. Could you make me happy? His emotional underdevelopment had left him unwise to what the pattern was with Hinata's habits through much of their friendship, but the drawings in the notebook were stark enough to shatter that veil. The realization caused his face to flush red. Oh, he muttered to himself under his breath. It all felt so obvious now that he had actually been given ample evidence to confirm a theory he had formed subconsciously some time ago. Patting his cheeks to try to control the heat in his face, Naruto took a deep breath and then let it go. Well, I guess it all makes sense now. I wonder how long she's felt like that, he wondered silently. His thoughts were then interrupted by the sound of the classroom door opening. The blonde quickly flipped the notebook back to its original page and set it where it had been in the first place. As expected, Hinata and Iruka entered the room a moment later. The heiress swiftly made her way up to the elevated desk that she and Naro both sat at, stopping to smile at him warmly before sitting down to his left and focusing on Iruka again. The lesson then resumed. Throughout it, Naruto found himself feeling distinctly happy. Nate threw his nose and stared out the window boredly. Late night tea had always been a favorite of his uncle's, and he generally indulged in it at least twice per week. Depending on the climate of his moods, it could be as many as 5 times. This fact was inconsequential to the vast majority of the Hyuga clan, but to Neji, it greatly affected his schedule past 8 o'clock, which was usually supposed to be his free time. Any night that Hiyashi wished to have tea, Neji was required to be there in case there were any messes to clean up. Those were the formal reasons. Anyway, Ne had always had a hunch that his presence was required more for the sake of conversation than anything else. The man had been very obviously lonely since the passing of his wife, and he had few people to converse with. It was only a theory, of course, and one that Ne could not voice in good faith. Either way, he hardly minded the task. Little was required of him beyond simply existing in the same room as Hiyashi for anywhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours. The branch Haga slowly turned his attention away from the dim scenery of the window into his uncle, who was studying a piece of paperwork. In fact, the clan head had been looking over the same stack of files for a number of minutes by this point. With his curiosity on the rise, Neji cleared his throat to gain Hai's attention. This may be intrusive of me, but would you mind telling me what exactly you're looking at? Hai-sama. He asked properly. The clan head looked up from the material. Naruto Uzumaki's billing history for the past 18 months, he replied. The branch Hyuga raised an eyebrow and turned in his chair to fully face his uncle. I have several questions, he said, quite puzzled by the response he had received and the ease with which it had been given. Hayashi chuckled. As you should. Ask away, he said humorously. Neji then stood up and walked up to the older man's desk to take a glance at the papers. First of all, where and how did you even get your hands on somebody else's billing history? He asked skeptically. Hayashi smiled slightly. I have friends in high places in most businesses. I can acquire most information at a request as long as it isn't too sensitive. That is, he replied. Ne considered pressing for details, but opted against it in favor of asking his second question. All right. So why, pray tell, did you feel the need to view Uzuki-san's financial records? That seems more than a bit odd to me, he inquired. At this question, the clan head's expression darkened just a tad. Because I had a hunch, something I needed to either confirm or deny with evidence. Unfortunately, my findings have been consistent with my hypothesis so far, he said vaguely as he looked over the documents in front of him. He then took a sip of his tea. As it turns out, Uzuki-san has been charged 30% more than he should be given the size and quality of his apartment. He's provided with welfare by the Hokage each month to keep him stable financially. And under fair circumstances, it would be more than enough for him to buy food and even indulge in a hobby or two. Under this kind of pressure, he can hardly afford food, he explained with a scowl. Neji folded his arms across his chest and furrowed his brow. You'd think that Hokage-sama would have caught this quite some time ago. Based on what I know, the two have a fairly close relationship, he pointed out. Hayashi sighed tiredly. My schedule is less than a quarter as busy as his, and I still struggle to find time to really observe the struggles of my children. The same issue almost certainly plagues him, but to a much greater degree. Checking Uzumaki-san's records for consistency and crunching the numbers would take time. He likely doesn't have to spare, he inferred. Neji shook his head and returned to his seat. If you went out of your way to find this out for sure, I'm assuming you have plans to do something about it. He asked. The clan head nodded and leaned back in his chair. Yes, I'll be funneling some of my own funds into his each month to cover the extra he's being charged. As much as I'd like to directly confront the bank about this, the elders would have my head for involving myself so heavily in the business of a pariah, he responded. Neji nodded and stretched his back. That sounds reasonable to me, though I still do find it curious that you have no objections to Uzuki-san, especially in regards to his ever-blossoming relationship with Hinata-sama, he commented. The clan head shrugged. I never understood the I directed his way in all honesty. Sure, he contains something dark, but that's hardly his fault. After having spoken to him in person, he's actually quite considerate, more so than I had predicted. I much prefer him over the Inuzuka's mud of a son, he said, his tone akin to a grumble by the end. Neji laughed at the memory of the renowned clan of Hound's failed attempt to foster a betrothal between Hinata and Ka Inuzuka. Not a high bar, but your approval of any person as a future partner of Hinata-sama is great praise indeed, he said through his chuckles. From there, the pair lapsed into silence as Hiyashi continued to analyze the financial documents. After another 20 minutes or so, Neji spoke once again. What did you mean when you said Yusuzuki-san had something dark inside of him? He asked in reference to a stray statement by his uncle. The clan head eyed his nephew intently before returning his gaze to the papers. Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to, he said shortly. The branch Hyuga pursed his lips. Pressing any further was unwise, and he knew it. Frustrating as it was, he decided to let it go. Within an hour, he was excused to ponder what he had learned and what he had not. Hinata thanked the receptionist and turned her attention towards the stairs. Naruto had been entirely absent from the academy for the past 2 days, and she was greatly concerned. She had intended to come to check on him after the first day, but her obligations to her clan had gotten in the way. She had a number of theories as to why he was not attending the academy at present. The first and most prominent of which was that he had come down with a sickness of some kind. All things considered, it felt like the most likely possibility. The other options she had considered ranged from things as mundane as Naruto cutting class to something as extreme as a kidnapping. She knew that her questions would be answered upon reaching his door, but she still couldn't help but fret. It was simply her nature, especially in regards to Nar. Her trek up the stairs took around 30 seconds, and once she reached the top, she quickly made her way down to the end of the hall where she knew Nar lived. Upon reaching his door, she carefully knocked 3 times and then folded her hands down by her waist while she waited for a response. Though it took a minute or two, Nar eventually did answer his door. When he came into view after opening the entrance to his home, it became clear that his decision to stay home had been a wise one. He was pale white, his eyes were red and slightly swollen, and his hair was disheveled. Sickness had taken hold of him sometime recently, and it had yet to release him from its grasp. Encouragingly, Naruto's face lit up a little at the sight of Hinata. Taking this as a prompt to speak first, the Aries snapped out of her trance of silence. Oh my, you look quite ragged, she said, her tone rife with worry and concern as she looked Naruto up and down. The blonde scratched the back of his head and forced a smile despite his obvious discomfort. Yeah, I'm sick as a dog. Something's been going around lately, so I probably caught whatever that is. I'll be out of class for the next week or so, I think, he said with a suppressed cough. Hinata felt her spirits fall a bit at the notion of attending without him by her side during lessons, but she maintained an outwardly positive appearance. Taking a step towards him and into his apartment, she gestured to the interior. See, can I come in? I haven't seen Wu in a few days, so I'd like to spend time together, she requested hopefully. The blonde took a step back and held up his hands in front of himself in a defensive manner. Is that really a good idea, though? I'm still really sick and I don't want you to catch whatever I've got, he pointed out cautiously. The heiress then took another step forward and closed the door behind her. It was a silent statement, but an effective one. I don't care one bit. I have a strong immune system, so I think I'll be okay. She assured him. Nar opened his mouth to protest, but shut it again. He then shrugged his shoulders tiredly. Okay, suit yourself. I'm probably not going to be any fun, though. I have a splitting headache, he replied before turning around and making his way to his couch. Once he reached it, he flopped down and leaned back. Hinata, who was still at the door, felt a pang of sympathy for her classmate. He was in poor condition. Watching him try to move around had made that even more clear to the AYS. With a new sense of protectiveness, Hinata swiftly crossed the apartment and sat herself down beside him on the couch. Have you been getting lots of rest? Sleeping would be a great help. She asked as Naruto slumped into the cushion of the furniture. He gave a weak nod and groaned quietly as another wave of pain seemed to crash through his skull. Napping is the only way to pass time in a way that doesn't completely suck. So yeah, I've been doing a lot of he said, cutting himself short to grasp his temples and rock back and forth to quell his aches. At this sight, Hinata reached forward and laid her hands on his shoulders. She then turned him slightly and gently guided him down onto his back with his head resting in her lap. What are you doing? The blonde asked wearily. The heiress then tapped his temples on both sides with her index fingers. A small jolt of chakra then passed through his body. Though initially agitated by the action, Nar soon found that his head was in far less pain. Just an old trick my mother taught me. It won't make it go away all the way, but it should help for now. Hinata informed him, gingerly tracing the whisker markings on his cheeks as she spoke to him. The blonde gazed up at her and pursed his lips. You probably shouldn't be touching me. You're going to get sick, he said quietly as the AYS let her hand rest on his cheek while the other supported his head. Hinata sighed happily and reveled in his closeness to her. So be it then. If I get sick, then maybe I'll be quarantined with you. I'd very much like that, she said absently, quite clearly somewhere else entirely mentally speaking. Nar instantly reined at her words. You would. I don't really know how to respond to that, he said awkwardly. His words brought Hinata back to reality, and when she returned, she too gained color. Oh, I was thinking out loud. She stuttered, embarrassed by her slip of the tongue. The outcast boy studied her for a moment. Maybe you should do more of that. You quit stuttering when you do, he commented. Hinata brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Well, thinking less and feeling more might be a good start, I suppose, she said vaguely. Before Nar could respond, she leaned down and kissed his forehead affectionately. When she returned her head to a more level position, the shock on Naruto's face was visible. I really am sorry for trying to kiss you in the forest, but I can't help it right now. I'm feeling strongly about you right now. It's because you're sick. I think it's making me feel a bit protective, she said softly. It took him a significant amount of time, but Nar eventually found his voice. Why do I feel really warm? He asked innocently. Hinata shook her head and lifted up his head to hold it to her chest. Because you haven't been cared for the right way. You're underfed, underappreciated, and undermedicated. Let me fix that. I want to take care of you. Let me baby you a little, she said with his ear pressed to her heart. After a few moments, she laid his head back down in her lap. Will you let me? It would make me very happy, she asked. Nar swallowed and nodded his head uncertainly. You said something about your mom earlier. I've never heard you talk about her before. What's she like? He asked after a stretch of silence. Hinata didn't answer him at first, but eventually she responded. My mother passed away several years ago. She came down with a sickness much like you have and she didn't make it, she explained a tad shakily. The blonde immediately tensed. I did not mean to bring back those memories. I'm so sorry, Hinata. He apologized frantically. The AYS shook her head and brushed a hand through his hair. No, you had no way to know. Besides, it's been a long time. It doesn't hurt the way it used to. She was a wonderful woman, very gentle and patient, extremely kind to everybody, she recalled. A smile then formed on her face, though she had fire in her when pushed. My father feared no one more than his own wife, she said with a light chuckle. Nar returned the smile and shifted a bit to make himself more comfortable. Sounds like you take after her. She sounds a lot like you to me, he said. Hinata's cheeks turned slightly pink at his words. I'm hardly half the saint she was. You'd know what I mean if you met her. I'm only modeling myself after her. Honestly, I feel a little bit guilty about you, she said quietly. The blonde furrowed his brow. Why is that? You haven't done anything wrong, Hinata. He asked skeptically. The Hyuga girl quit running her hand through his hair and let it rest on his cheek. I'm very much making up for lost time right now. All that I'm doing, I've wanted to do for years. I've always wanted to hold you and make you warm. I spent years watching you and dreaming. All the while, I left you all alone. It took a chance event for me to finally bridge the distance and give you my appreciation. I let you freeze, she said numbly. Nar shook his head. I mean, I get why you're feeling guilty, but it really isn't that bad. You're kind of shy normally, so approaching people can be hard for you. I get it. Don't feel bad. You're making me happier than I have been ever. Pretty much, he said reassuringly. I'm glad you feel that way, but I still can't help but feel like I could have done so much more. All those times I watched you cry in the training field, pick yourself back up, and keep going just because you had nobody help you. I could have been the one to encourage you. Maybe you didn't need it, but still, the heiress replied dejectedly. Nar then reached and took hold of the hand that was caressing his face, gently lacing his fingers through hers. I taught myself how to work hard, and I learned a lot of stuff on my own. Having a friend would have been nice, but I'm probably stronger than I would have been if I had one. Don't beat yourself up. You're my favorite person. I don't like watching you get sad, he said kindly. One specific thing he had said garnered a visible reaction from Hinata. Favorite, she whispered with a hand covering her mouth. Of all the things she had expected to be told by Naruto at any point, a declaration of favoritism had not been high on the list of possibilities. Yeah, you're literally all I've got, and honestly, I don't think I need a whole lot else, the blonde said with averted eyes. He was then snatched up and tightly embraced by the heiress, whose eyes were clamped shut. Thank you, she stammered, her voice muffled by Naruto's shirt as she buried her face in his shoulder. No problem, but see, could you not squeeze me so hard? I'm going to break in half. The blonde wheezed. Hinata did not release him, but she did as she was told and lightened her grip on him. Sorry, I've just wanted to hear something like that from you for the longest time. She murmured with her face still hidden in the crook of his neck. You're strong as hell. Holding me up like this can't be easy, Nar joked. Hinata shifted her gaze to his eyes and gazed at him. My clan's conditioning program is hellish, but it has its perks. Though I can't imagine you feel too proud of being cradled by a girl like this, she teased him. The blonde puffed out his cheeks. I'm half dead. This doesn't count. He countered defensively. Hinata giggled and let him rest in her lap again. True enough. I'll be making sure you don't leave me, though. I can't be here during the day, obviously. But I'll spend every evening with you until you get better, she assured him. The blonde smiled. Well, you might get sick, too, so that might not actually happen. But at least you aren't stuttering anymore, he replied. The eyes shrugged. I think it has to do with comfort. When I first knocked on your door today, I was worried and nervous because of your absence. Now I'm content. I just hope I quit stuttering with other people, too, she said. The blonde smile widened into a grin. Yeah, so do I. You're way more fun when you're not nervous, he said. Hinata nodded and glanced to a nearby clock. A sigh then escaped her. I think I have to leave. Curfew and such, she said sadly. The blonde's face fell a tad, but he didn't complain as there was no point in doing so. After carefully sliding out from under his head and upper body, Hinata covered Naruto with a blanket. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll bring you something to eat as well, she promised before turning and making her way to the door. As she turned the handle, she looked back to the blonde one last time. Good night, Naruto. Nar rubbed his eyes as he lay awake in his bed. It was nearly midnight, and he had hardly slept at all. He was certainly tired, and his body was sore enough, but he still had not been able to drift off into unconsciousness fully yet. The reasons for this were fairly obvious, and they made his temporary insomnia more than bearable. Let me fix that. I want to take care of you. Let me baby you a little. The words of Hinata had been bouncing around in his mind for a number of hours, but that statement in particular had stuck with him the most strongly. For another person to be so unconditionally dedicated to him was a foreign experience to Nar and one that he found himself missing greatly now that he was alone in his apartment. Jokes aside, he had been more comfortable than he would have cared to admit with his head resting in the AY's arms. Sick as he was, her sweet words and pleasant features made him feel about as healthy as was possible given his condition. She's cute, like really cute, he thought to himself, the image of Hinata's contented face passing through his mind as he pondered that evening's events. Indeed, Hinata was quite attractive. Her haircut was a tad odd in terms of its lack of length, but everything else screamed of fairness. Beyond his realization that he very much liked her physical appearance, Naruto's discovery in the notebook at the academy had been validated without question. She had ignored her own health to comfort him, and much of what she said to him had been greatly affectionate in nature. She even kissed me on the forehead. I can still feel where she did it, too. The blonde mused to himself. Hinata's feelings were no longer a mystery to him in any way. She was hardly hiding it anymore, and for that, Naruto was glad. Her soft words of appreciation and gentle hands brought him a joy he had never known before. With all of that in mind, only one question remained in regards to Hinata. What was the nature of his feelings? Did they match hers? Would he have stayed with her in the face of sickness to keep her company? The answers to all of these questions were identical. A resounding and firm, yes, I meant it when I said, you were my favorite person, and I think I know what that means now. He thought, allowing the end of the confirmation of his feelings to simply fade into his subconscious. There was no need to dwell too hard on it all. There wasn't much to dwell on. It was quite straightforward. With his emotions sorted and organized, Naruto kicked his legs over the side of his bed and hopped down to the floor. After a brief period of navigation through his darkened apartment, he reached the kitchen. Once there, he opened a specific drawer and retrieved the item he had come to look for. His unfinished project, turning on the kitchen overhead light to better view the object, Naruto held it up and studied it. The structure was completed, but there were still alterations that could be made. It also lacked any distinct details beyond its shape. It was a blank slate, and it could still be turned into something more focused, something more meaningful. Nar set the project down on his dining table and went on a short, successful quest to track down the necessary pencils to complete his new vision for the object. For nearly an hour, Naruto worked away at the project, changing details, altering pre-existing aspects of it, and even adding on to it. It was fairly tedious work, but he knew that it would be worth it in the end. His sleeping schedule would suffer for it, but he also had no place to be the next day or the day after, chances were. Once the necessary preparations were complete, the blonde held it up to the light once again and nodded to himself in approval of his work. It was completed and ready to be presented. I hope she likes it. It isn't perfect, but it's about as good as it's going to be, he thought to himself. He then put the object back in the same drawer and shut off the kitchen light. With the area as it was before he had arrived, Nar began dragging himself back to bed. He did eventually make it to his mattress, but he was out cold before he could even make it under the blankets. He slept nicely despite his headache. Hinata straightened her clothes and took a deep breath. By this point, she was well used to interacting with Naruto for extended periods of time, and it was no longer legitimately stressful, but she still felt self-imposed pressure to be her best self in his presence. Both physically and mentally, her outfit was as it always was, with a slightly oversized cream-colored jacket, basic pants, sandals, and undershirt. She had considered abandoning the jacket due to the seasonal heat, but her still lacking self-confidence prevented her from actually following through on the idea. The AYS then knocked on Naruto's door 3 times, as was the standard procedure she had been taught at a young age. No direct answer came, but she was given a muffled verbal welcome, which she took as permission to open the door and enter his apartment. Once inside, she scanned the interior for her classmate. Initially, she found no sign of him. It wasn't until roughly 2 minutes had passed before he came into view. He emerged from the singular hallway in the dwelling where she assumed his bedroom lay wearing a set of pajamas, disheveled head of hair. He had been sleeping from the looks of things. Sorry for the wait. Dragging myself out of bed always takes a while, he said through a yawn. Hinata smiled at the sight and watched Naruto slowly lumber over to the kitchen counter, which he leaned himself against for support. He looked marginally less sickly than he had the day before, and his headache seemed less cripplingly painful, if his demeanor was any indication. He also appeared to have taken her advice in regards to getting extensive amounts of sleep. No problem at all. I should be apologizing. Really, it seems I woke you up, the Haug replied Jovi, her mood lifted somewhat by the sight of a slightly recovered Nar. The blonde nodded and rubbed his eyes tiredly. He was still quite groggy, which Hinata found extremely endearing. No stutter at all, huh? Guess that problem is solved. Nar commented with a sleepy smile. The AYS scratched the back of her head, a subconscious habit she had unknowingly taken from her classmate. Don't jinx me. I might start up again. For now, though, I feel very comfortable speaking with you. I'm still getting there with other people, she admitted. Nar removed his weight from the kitchen counter and stretched. You'll get there. That sort of thing takes time, I think. And hey, I'm glad that I get to see it at least. You've got a nice voice, he said. The compliment pleased Hinata greatly, and unlike previous occasions, she was able to control the heat in her cheeks. I'm glad you think so. If I have it my way, you'll be hearing it lots, she said happily, earning a ragged laugh from Nar. You're getting braver every day and yeah, I'd like that. I'll be back in class by next week, so you won't have to play babysitter for a whole lot longer, he said, covering his mouth to cough a few times after finishing his sentence. Hinata shook her head and walked past him to the dining table. I asked to take care of you, and I'm going to follow through. Any excuse I can use to help you, I'll take, she said as she set out a pair of small boxes on either side of the table. The blonde frowned and made his way to her side. What's all this stuff? He asked curiously. The heiress sat herself down on the leftmost chair of the table and gestured to the seat opposite her. Don't you remember, Naruto-kun? I said, I would bring you food last night. I like to keep my promises. She reminded him while she opened her small bento. Nar did as he was being directed to do and sat down across from Hinata. He then skeptically opened the bento and studied its contents carefully. It's ramen with some rice mixed in. A few other things, too. I figured you'd be hungry, so I made extra for you. The AYS informed him as he poked at it with his chopsticks. With the identity of his food revealed, Naruto took a bite of it. Hinata watched him chew with bated breath. She had been a tad bold when it came to spices, and she knew little of her classmates' culinary preferences. After a few moments of judgment, the blonde grinned, much to her relief. Never really had anything like this, but man, that's really good. You making me actually like rice probably should have tipped me off, but you're a great cook. He complimented her, taking another sizable bite of his food in between sentences. If you like, I could cook for you more often. Hinata offered, sighing heavily at the 2 small slips she had suffered while speaking. The blonde nodded rapidly. That'd be awesome. You don't have to, but I'd definitely eat anything you make, he said eagerly. Hinata merely nodded, not trusting herself to not stutter horribly so soon after such a personally gratifying compliment. Noticing this easily, Naruto tilted his head to one side. Did I freak you out or something? You're looking kind of shell-shocked. He asked. The heiress sighed and shook her head before sampling her own food. Compliment a girl on her cooking and you're bound to make her very happy. Naruto-kun, she said quietly. The pair then ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before they both finished their meals and pushed the boxes to the center of the table. Thanks for this, Hinata. Eating with you is always nice, especially when it's stuff you made, the blonde said gratefully. Though she was extremely pleased with his appreciation of her cooking and her company, Hinata still found herself slightly disappointed by something. I'm glad you feel that way, but do you need space? Sleep is extremely important for you right now, she asked. Much to her dismay, the blonde nodded reluctantly. Yeah, probably. I'd like to talk more, but my head is really killing me. I'm just used to it at this point, he said honestly, clearly saddened by the reality of his physical condition. Just as Hinata began to stand up to gather her things, however, Naruto continued speaking. There's something I want to give you, though. Wait where you are, he said vaguely before disappearing into the hall from whence he had come. After a minute of audible rummaging and rearranging, he returned. He was holding a small object in his left hand and he was clearly trying to conceal it from her view. Deciding to let it be a surprise, the AYS patiently waited for him. When he settled in front of her, he held it out. Hinata then observed it fully for the first time. When she realized what it was, her heart melted. I know it's sort of dumb looking, but I tried my best. You don't have to keep it if you don't want it, Nar said self-consciously as he held out a small origami rendition of Hinata herself. It was shockingly well made, and it was colored to match her hair color and her usual outfit. He had even drawn a surprisingly faithful sketch of her face onto the head, though it was slightly cartoonish. The eyes carefully accepted it into her hands and marveled at it. Like I said, you don't have to take it, the blonde said quietly, causing Hinata to turn her head up from the origami. Naruto's eyes were staring down at the floor, and his posture radiated the opposite of confidence. He was nervous, and he appeared disappointed with himself. Hinata's reaction to this was instant and entirely automatic. She set the origami down, reached forward, cupped the sides of his face, and lifted it up to meet her gaze. Before he could react, she pressed her lips to his and closed her eyes. The bold gesture drew an uncharacteristic squeak from Naruto, who simply stood stiffly as Hinata kissed him. When she pulled her mouth from his, Hinata left her forehead to rest on his gingerly, slowly wrapping her arms around the back of his neck, she smiled warmly. It isn't dumb looking, and I'd be honored to take it. You're such a sweet boy, Naruto-kun, she said sincerely. When he didn't immediately respond, the heiress realized what she had just done. Sighing slightly, she glanced away from him. I know I shouldn't have done that, but I feel like I needed to. A simple thank you wasn't enough, she said dejectedly. She then began to pull away from him. Before she could, much to her surprise, Nar gripped her shoulders and pulled her back into him. Their lips then came together again, this time at Naruto's behest. Though she was initially shocked, the AYS quickly came to and returned the kiss wholeheartedly. When they separated, Hinata saw that his eyes were leaking tears. Needing no further prompting, Hinata pulled him into a tight hug and held his head to her shoulder. Sorry, I'm just feeling really weird and stuff. I don't know why. And the blonde began, trailing off into unintelligible sniffles by the end of the sentence. Hinata shook her head and gently brushed her hand through his hair. You don't need to tell me why. You've been starved for affection for far too long. Cry as much as you need to. I'll be right here, she said kindly. Nar did just that for a number of minutes before pulling his head up and making a bit of space. I needed that. Thanks, Hinata, he said through a sniffle. The Arison leaned forward and kissed his cheek affectionately. Anything you need, I'll do my best to provide. I do love you after all, she said genuinely. She had taken a great risk in voicing her raw emotions so confidently, but it had the desired effect. Naruto's lips pulled into the ghost of a smile. I don't really understand why you would, but that makes me so happy. So happy. He said a tad hoarsely. Hinata traced the whisker-esque markings on his cheeks lightly. There are so many reasons why you dragged me up from depression more than once without even trying to, and I adore all your little habits and mannerisms. I know all of them, and I love each one. But things like this are the greatest reason why, she said vaguely. What do you mean? Nar asked skeptically. Hinata gestured to his origami and then moved her hands to grasp his. For all that you joke and bluster, you're thoughtful and kind. You may not remember it, but you saved me from a group of bullies when we were young. We'd never met before, but you took a beating for me. Then you went and made me an origami sculpture just because. She said. There was then a brief pause. I don't care if you don't love me, Naruto-kun. For years, I thought that was what I needed. I'd still be beside myself with glee if you do, but just being able to make you understand that you're precious is enough for me either way, she said, her voice gaining a tone of melancholy. Nar gave her hands a squeeze. Me kissing you should have tipped you off, doofus. You're my only friend and my favorite person by a mile. I don't really know how love works, but I'm pretty sure I love you, Hinata. He replied with a smile. Despite her previous composure, the phrase, I love you, Hinata, completely drove the Hyuga girl over a cliff. She pushed off the balls of her feet and tackled Naruto to the ground, landing on top of him on the floor. Did you have to tackle me? The blonde complained sarcastically as Hinata settled atop him. She then peered up from his lower chest. I've waited years to hear those words. I dreamed them. I wrote about them, and I honestly thought I'd never hear them. Can you really blame me? She asked innocently. Nar blushed noticeably. Man, I really should have started talking to you sooner. Sounds like we were both waiting for something, he said awkwardly. The AYS shook her head and mounted herself on his waist. I think the time had to be right. A few years ago, I'd have fainted at the prospect of being alone in a room with you. I also wasn't as sure of how I felt about you then. Now I know for sure and I had a better idea of how to love you quietly until it was time to tell you, she said. Nar shifted a little underneath her. That makes sense. But oh, why are you sitting on me? He asked skeptically. Hinata then flattened herself over him and laid a hand on the side of his face. Because I want to kiss you more. I want to nuzzle you, too. I want to make you feel loved, she said. Nar blinked several times. I'm sort of bad at kissing though, he pointed out. The ice shrugged her shoulders and gave him a peck on the nose. I had never kissed anybody before you. That was my first. I'm not good at it either. Let's learn to be good at it together. She suggested, finding that he had no qualms with the idea. Naruto nodded. Needing no other prompts, Hinata fitted her lips to his. Little was said in the following hour, but there was no need. By the time the heiress reluctantly left with the origami in hand, both were out of breath, and most of Naruto's face had been touched by Hinata's lips. Nar yawned and made his way to his front door, which was being knocked on somewhat forcefully. It was early, hardly 6 o'clock in the morning, and he was half asleep. Despite his lack of legitimate consciousness, the volume of the sound of his door had drawn him from his bed. When he reached the door frame, he opened the entrance and rubbed his eyes. Who he saw on the other side snapped him awake instantaneously. Standing tall just outside his apartment was Hiyashi Hyuga. His expression was difficult to pin down in terms of what emotion it was conveying, but it certainly wasn't one that brought Naruto great comfort. Good morning, Uzuki-san. You slept well, I trust. He greeted the boy politely. Tongue-tied for a moment, Nar took a bit of time to reply. Yeah, I did. Good morning to you, too. Hi Ashi-sama, he replied with a frantic bow. The clan head waved a dismissive hand and stepped forward. I appreciate the respect, but I'd prefer to skip formalities for the most part. May I come in? He asked. The blonde stepped aside from his door and nodded. Yeah, of course, he said nervously. The man then briskly walked inside and allowed the blonde to shut the door behind him. Hai swiftly made his way to the dining table and sat down. Easily receiving the silent message, Naruto followed suit and sat down across from him. Once they were both situated, the clan head cleared his throat. Well, I certainly never expected my own daughter to be so assertive, he said, seemingly well aware that no clarification was needed for Naruto to understand exactly what he was talking about. Tensing slightly, the blonde drummed his fingers on the table pensively. Neither did I, honestly, but I'm glad she was. She really got her point across, he said with an uncomfortable chuckle. Hayashi raised an eyebrow. Not even a single frantic apology. I'm impressed. You're more fortified than I thought you were, my young friend. He complimented the blonde. Nar relaxed a bit. I mean, there's no reason you'd be here other than Hinata, so I sort of knew what to expect when you showed up, he explained. The older man nodded and rested his elbows on the table. In that case, let's get down to exactly why I'm here. Hinata did what she could to contain herself when she returned home last night, but it was blatantly obvious that she was extremely pleased, also quite red-faced. It took very little prodding to get her to open up, he recounted. Nar swallowed the lump in his throat. I'm guessing you're pretty pissed at me then, he inquired. Much to his shock and relief, Hiyashi shook his head. No, not in the least. I'm not here to berate you. You've made her very happy, and it seems that she's done the same for you. I'm not so cruel as to drive a wedge in between the two of you. I'm here to discuss something else, actually, he corrected. The blonde furrowed his brow at this. I mean, I'm glad and thank you, but what else would you be here for than to yell at me or something? He asked, quite puzzled by the new revelation. The clan head made a wide sweeping motion with his hand to the full interior of Naruto's apartment. I have an offer for you, something I suggest you think hard about, he began. He then took a deep breath and set his sights on the blonde. Would you like to take up residence in the Hyuga estate? I already ran this idea by Hinata and Nei last night, and they were both perfectly alright with it. Hinata, especially, there are a few stragglers here and there who don't think much of you, but I'd trust you to change their opinions, he asked. Naruto's eyes widened to saucers. Wait, really? Is this a joke? Because you've definitely got me if it is, he said, totally dumbstruck by what Hiashi was suggesting. The clan head barked a short laugh. I'm not very funny and I hardly ever joke. I'm entirely serious. Perhaps I shouldn't tell you this, but your rent has been overinflated for years now. I've done what I can to curb it, but you're bound to continue living in near poverty if you remain here, he said. The blonde growled and glanced at his door. I knew those bills were way too expensive. But are you really sure you want me living in your house? I'm pretty messy, he asked. Hai smirked. Oh, I'll break you of that messiness in short order. And if you're worried about the Hyuga's publicity, don't be. I'm quite a good propagandist when I need to be. You'd be staying in a guest room across the hall from Neji in the branch house, he said. Nar frowned. You've said that name twice. Who's this Nei guy? He asked curiously. The clan head rested his chin on his interlaced fingers. He's my nephew. 2 years older than you, I believe. He's also Hinata's bodyguard, he said, adding the final line for effect. The blonde flinched. Is he going to beat me up for being around Hinata a lot? He asked nervously, earning another laugh from Hiashi. He's fairly mellow, but if you overstep your boundaries, it's possible. He's much stronger than either you or Hinata, he replied. Nar remained silent for a few moments. I think I want to do this. You can kick me out whenever, but I'd like to live with you guys, he said carefully. The clan head nodded and stood to his feet. Complete your daily tasks and maintain your manners, and that won't be a concern. Also, try to keep your ahem episodes with Hinata behind closed doors. Though, she oddly seems the more forward between the two of you, so maybe I'll give you leeway, he said. Hai then began walking, but not towards the door. Where are you going exactly? Nar asked. The older man shrugged his shoulders and glanced back at him. I'm going to help you pack. We're getting this over with before noon. So guys, what do you think about this Naruto story? Tell me your opinion in the comments. And if you want more Naruto what if stories, make sure to subscribe to Universe of Naruto. Thanks for watching.